She was 22 and cold. No deed, no savings account, no key to the front door, just her grandmother's unfinished rug panel and $9 she had folded inside a cotton handkerchief after counting it twice. And with that $9, she bought a forgotten hand-knotted rug loom shop in a hollow outside Asheville, Buncombe County, North Carolina, a place the map stopped naming after 1978. The roof sagged above the west wall. Rain had softened the floor near the chimney. The county said the building had been closed since 1999 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that inside the hollow oak warp beam, behind two sealed brass end caps that had not been opened in over 40 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Thea Maren Whitlow had been leaving her whole life without knowing it. She had learned the habit early, before she had words for it, in a clapboard house where rooms seemed to belong more strongly to the adults who argued in them than to the children who slept there. She knew how to step around a loose board without sounding it, how to close a drawer by lifting the handle first, how to carry a cup of water so the ice did not strike glass. Her childhood had not been cruel in the way people expect cruelty to announce itself. There were breakfasts, there were clean sheets, there were winter coats bought at the end of the season and kept in a hall closet smelling of cedar blocks. But even in those ordinary provisions, there was a careful ledger running underneath, a sense that every kindness had been written down somewhere and might one day be called back. Her father, Rowan Whitlow, had been a man of exact hands. He repaired clocks, fence latches, drawer pulls, cracked chair legs, the hinge on the pantry door, and once a small music box shaped like a chapel that had belonged to Thea's mother when she was a girl. He never said much while working. He laid each screw on a white saucer, lined in order of removal, and rubbed his thumb across the metal before returning it to place. He had loved things by keeping them useful. When Thea was 6, he taught her to sand with the grain. When she was 8, he let her hold a plane against a pine board while his hand covered hers. When she was 12, he showed her how to sharpen a blade on a wet stone until its edge took the light like a thin line of water. He did not praise loudly. He set the finished object between them and nodded once. That was enough. Her mother, Leanne, moved through the house with a nervous neatness that made every room feel nearly ready for guests who never came. She wore soft cardigans and kept grocery receipts clipped by month in envelopes. She knew how to turn leftover ham into soup, soup into beans, beans into lunch, packed in wax paper. In public, she had a gentle voice. At home, she carried silence like a bowl filled too full. After Rowan died, that silence changed shape. It hardened first around the dining table, then around the staircase, then around every object that had known his hands. His wool work coat disappeared from the peg by the back door. His tools were boxed, not sorted, and carried to the shed. The clock he had been repairing on his last good morning was placed in a closet with its brass face wrapped in newspaper. Thea was 16 then, too young to understand probate, old enough to understand removal. There was one place that had never felt removed from her. Every other Saturday, when the weather held and the Blue Ridge Parkway was not closed by fog or ice, Thea rode with her father's sister, Ruthie Whitlow, to a one-room weaving shed behind a narrow house north of Weaverville. Ruthie was not her grandmother by blood, though Thea had called her Grandma Ruthie since she could speak, because some names are given by care and do not ask permission from family trees. Ruthie had been a rug maker for 40 years, though she disliked the word artist when it was applied to herself. She called herself a hand worker. Her shed smelled of lanolin, wood smoke, onion skins, black walnut hulls, iron water, lavender sachets, and the faint mineral odor of old wool. Against one wall stood a vertical loom taller than any doorway in Thea's house. The warp threads ran from beam to beam in pale, disciplined rows, each one under tension, each one waiting. Thea's first tasks were modest. She sorted skeins by color. She wound wool into balls. She swept clipped ends from the floor with a corn broom. Ruthie taught her to recognize shades by names that sounded like weather and food: storm blue, milkweed, sorghum, creekstone, butternut, sumac, clay after rain. When Thea's hands grew steady, Ruthie showed her knots. The Turkish knot came first, though Ruthie called it by its older name, Geordes, because she believed tools and methods deserved their proper titles. 2 warp threads, 1 short length of wool, around the left, around the right, both ends drawn forward, tightened with the thumbnail, then cut level after a row had been set. There was rhythm in it, but not hurry. Ruthie could make a line of knots with the patient authority of someone writing a letter to the dead. "Do not tug like you're angry," she said. "The wool remembers." That was the sentence Thea kept. Ruthie did not mean that yarn had a mind or that cloth carried human sorrow in some magical way. She meant that pressure remained visible. A knot pulled too hard narrowed the pattern. A thread left slack made a weak place. Care was not a feeling, she said. It was evidence. Anybody could talk tenderly. Only the work told the truth. On winter Saturdays, Ruthie heated bricks on the wood stove and wrapped them in towels for Thea's feet. On spring days, she propped the door open and let birdsong come in with the scent of thawed earth. In summer, they worked early before the shed grew close and wool fibres clung to their wrists. In fall, Ruthie made coffee strong enough to stain a spoon and let Thea drink half a cup with milk while they studied old rug patterns pinned to the wall. Some came from European coverlets, some from Cherokee river cane basket designs, some from women whose names had been lost before anyone had written them down. Ruthie never treated that loss as ordinary. "A pattern is a person trying not to disappear," she said once, touching the edge of a faded drawing. Mind it. Thea minded it. She minded the way a diamond could hold a mountain, how stepped lines could become water, how a border could keep the eye from wandering out of the story. She minded the way Ruthie never wasted wool, tying short lengths into practice bundles and saving clippings for stuffing draft snakes. She minded the plain shelf where 30 small practice rugs stood rolled in brown paper, each tied with cotton string. Ruthie called them her memory pieces. Then one October morning, Ruthie's chair by the stove was empty. The call came before daylight. Leanne answered, listened, and lowered herself slowly into the kitchen chair without taking off her robe. Ruthie had died in her sleep, the way older people are said to die when the living are trying not to speak of shock. Thea rode to the weaving shed 3 days later with her father's older son Elias, who had taken over many of the arrangements with a clipboard, a dark coat, and a borrowed authority that settled on him too easily. The shed had already been opened. The upright loom was gone. So were the walnut-dyed skeins, the old beater, Ruthie's curved knife, the rolled samples from the shelf, and the cedar chest where she kept notebooks tied with blue ribbon. Elias said the estate sale company had moved quickly because damp weather was coming. He said storage was expensive. He said Thea could keep a narrow strip of unfinished rug panel that had been found under folded feed sacks. She held it in both hands. 6 inches of border, 3 colors, 1 line of knots not yet cut. The loss did not make a sound in her throat. It moved lower than that, into her hands, which would not uncurl for the rest of the ride home. Elias Whitlow had never raised his voice when a lowered one would do more lasting work. He was 14 years older than Thea, Rowan's son from a first marriage, with polished shoes, winter-pale eyes, and a habit of pausing before he answered, as though every sentence had to pass through a law office before reaching his mouth. After their father died, he became careful in public, dutiful in emails, prompt with forms and cold in ways that left no bruise anyone could name. When the court appointed him temporary manager of the estate during the inheritance dispute, she wore the role as if it had been tailored for him. The house changed under his care. Locks were rekeyed, drawers were inventoried, Rowan's tools were marked pending valuation. The dining room became a place for folders, not meals. Men in clean boots came through and measured windows, acreage, outbuildings, frontage. They spoke in numbers and did not look at Thea except when she blocked a doorway. Leanne signed where Elias pointed. Thea watched her mother's hand move across paper in the same delicate script she used for birthday cards and church envelopes. There was no scene. That made it worse. Betrayal entered the house in daylight, carrying file folders. Using legal words, wiping its shoes before crossing the threshold. On a Thursday in late March, Thea came home from her shift at a bakery outlet and found her suitcase on the porch. Not packed well, packed quickly. 2 pairs of jeans, 3 shirts. Her father's sharpening stone wrapped in a dish towel, the strip of Ruthie's unfinished rug panel folded inside a pillowcase, a hairbrush with broken bristles, her winter coat, though the day had turned warm. Beside the suitcase sat a cardboard box containing books, 1 chipped mug, and a framed photograph of Rowan standing beside a fence he had repaired the summer before he died. A new brass lock shone on the front door. Elias stood beneath the porch light, even though it was only 4 in the afternoon. He held a manila envelope against his chest with both hands. Behind him, through the screen, Thea could see her mother in the hall. Leanne wore her blue house slippers. 1 hand rested on the banister. The other held a folded tissue. Elias did not step aside. The property must remain protected during legal review. 8 words. He had practiced them. Thea could hear that. They were clean, neutral, and shaped to leave no place for a human being to stand. She looked past him once, not toward the rooms or the stairs or the things of her father still captive behind walls, but toward her mother's face. Leanne lowered her eyes. That was the moment. Not the lock, not the suitcase, not the envelope. The lowered eyes. Thea picked up the photograph first because glass breaks if forgotten. Then she lifted the suitcase by its hard plastic handle and felt the weight of her life pull unevenly toward one wheel. Elias offered the envelope. She did not take it. He set it on top of the cardboard box anyway, careful as a clerk. Rain began before she reached the end of the drive. For 6 weeks, she lived in distances. First, she stayed 2 nights behind a laundromat in Hendersonville, sleeping upright between the rear wall and a row of stacked milk crates because the dryer vents pushed warm air into the alley. Her $9 became $7.62 after a cup of coffee, a banana, and a packet of safety pins from a gas station counter. Then came Spartanburg, where a church opened its basement on cold nights and women slept on green cots under basketball trophies from years nobody remembered. Thea kept her suitcase looped through her arm while she slept. By then 1 wheel had cracked, and she had tied it with bakery twine. She washed in a library restroom at dawn, using paper towels dampened under a faucet that shut off every 7 seconds. She found day work twice, once unloading boxes behind a thrift store for $5 cash, once helping a florist strip leaves from rose stems before Mother's Day, that paid in sandwiches and bruised carnations which she left at a bus stop because carrying flowers without a room made her feel visible in a way she could not afford. In Greenville, she slept one night under the covered loading dock of a furniture warehouse, tucked behind wrapped dining chairs that smelled of cardboard and varnish. Freight trains passed somewhere beyond the dark. Each one shook the ground under her shoulder blades. She woke before sunrise with her fingers stiff around Ruthie's rug panel. The money diminished in exact little vanishings. $1 for bus fare when walking would have taken too long. 39 cents for a cup of hot water when a clerk insisted it could not be free. $2 for a locker at a station so she could apply for work without dragging her suitcase through the lobby. A quarter dropped into a vending machine and lost when the coil turned halfway, then stopped. By the time she reached Asheville again, she had $1, 3 dimes, and 4 pennies. She kept them in the cotton handkerchief, though there was no need for folding anymore. The coins could not get far. They made a dry sound in her coat pocket, a small weather of metal against cloth. The public library on Haywood Street opened at 9. Thea arrived at 8:30 and stood near the book return with 2 older men, a young mother with a stroller, and a man in paint-splattered pants who smelled faintly of turpentine. When the doors unlocked, nobody hurried. They entered with the solemn patience of people who understood shelter by the hour. Inside, the library was warm without being soft. Fluorescent lights hummed above the newspaper racks. Someone had left a pencil stub beside the community bulletin board. Thea went first to the restroom, then to the water fountain, then to a chair near the local history shelves where she could see the front door. She read newspapers because newspapers did not require a password. On the third morning, while turning the classified section with careful fingers, she saw the notice wedged between a listing for used feed troughs and a county auction of office furniture. County surplus structure and contents. Former weaving shop. Buncombe County permitted liquidation. Minimum bid, $9. Boyer responsible for removal. A pair. Taxes, liability. As is, N.O. Winkdy. Inquire clerk's office by Friday noon. Thea read it once as a stranger. Then she read it again as someone whose hands had known warp threads. Former weaving shop. Those 3 words did not open a door. They opened a smell. Lanolin, ash. Walnut hulls. Dust warmed by a stove. Ruthie's fingers guiding hers toward 2 pale strands and 1 short length of wool. Do not tug like you're angry. The wool remembers. She copied the notice onto the back of a church flyer advertising a pancake breakfast. Her pencil point broke on the word liability. She sharpened it with the edge of her father's pocket knife, catching the curls of yellow wood in her palm so they would not scatter on the library floor. At a computer station, she searched for the address with the slow caution of someone using minutes that did not belong to her. The place sat north and east of Asheville, beyond the newer roads near a bend where a creek crossed under a narrow bridge and the map thinned into grey lines. There were no photographs recent enough to trust. One county image showed a roof under trees. Another showed a sign so weathered the letters had become more shadow than paint. Thea checked the handkerchief in her pocket. $9 had been the minimum bid. She had less. That afternoon, she walked to the mission on Patton Avenue and asked about work. The woman at the desk had silver hair cut close to her head and a pencil tucked behind one ear. She listened while Thea spoke. She did not interrupt. Then she pointed toward the dining room, where volunteers were stacking metal chairs after lunch. We need the floors mopped, she said. No payroll. But I can give you $2 from petty cash. Thea mopped slowly and well. She moved chairs, swept first, rinsed the mop twice, cleaned under the serving table, and pressed the mop head into the wringer until her wrists ached. When she finished, the silver-haired woman placed 2 folded dollar bills on the edge of the counter and added a paper sack with a biscuit, an apple, and 2 hard-boiled eggs. Eat before you go, she said. Thea did. By Friday morning, the handkerchief held $9 exactly. 1 5. 3 ones. 4 quarters. No more, no less. The walk to the county building took her past storefront windows and cafe tables, past people drinking coffee from white cups, past planters filled with pansies that had survived a late frost. Thea watched her reflection move beside her in the glass, coat too heavy for the season, hair pinned poorly, suitcase left behind the mission desk with a paper tag tied to its handle, rug panel folded flat against her ribs inside her shirt, as if cloth could keep a heart from hearing too much. She reached the clerk's office before noon. The lobby smelled of toner, floor polish, and wet umbrellas. A man argued quietly about a permit near the far counter. A woman in a brown sweater stamped documents without looking up. Thea stood in line with the church flyer folded in her hand until the paper went soft at the creases. When her turn came, she slid the flyer forward. I came about the weaving shop, she said. The clerk looked at her coat, then at the notice, then at the clock. You have the minimum bid? Thea untied the handkerchief. She placed the bills and coins on the counter carefully, smoothing the 5 with 2 fingers, stacking the quarters so they would not roll. The clerk counted once, then again. She wrote something on a form, paused, and looked toward a hallway where file cabinets stood open in a row. Outside, traffic moved along the street with the steady indifference of an ordinary Friday. Inside, Thea waited while a brass clock ticked above the public records shelf and the smallest amount of money she had ever owned became, by law and ink and county procedure, the beginning of a place. The clerk reached for a folder the color of old wheat. What she did not know yet was that the road to that place would be longer than the map admitted, and that the building waiting at the end of it still held its breath around a loom no one had bothered to understand. The bus left Asheville before the sun had cleared the roofs. Thea sat in the third row from the back with the suitcase between her knees and the paper folder pressed flat beneath both palms, as though warmth from her hands could keep the ink from changing its mind. The driver had a grey ponytail and a cough that came from deep in his chest. He checked her ticket twice because the route did not carry many passengers out that way, especially not young women with broken luggage, and a county deed tucked inside a used envelope. By the time the bus passed Weaverville, the morning had thinned into a cold, polished brightness. Storefronts gave way to fences, fences to pasture, pasture to slopes where bare trees leaned together over the road like people exchanging careful news. Thea watched frost hold in the shadows after the fields had already begun to soften. A red-tailed hawk sat on a telephone pole without moving. Smoke rose from one chimney in a narrow blue column, then flattened where the wind found it. The driver let her off near a crossroads where the schedule said there was a stop, though. No bench, sign or shelter remained to prove it. A gas station that had once stood there was closed, its windows boarded from the inside, the pumps removed and their concrete islands left like worn teeth. Across the road, a hay barn leaned toward a field, its tin roof patched with 3 different colors of metal. "You sure this is it?" the driver asked. "Yes." He looked past her toward the road dropping east. "Long walk." "Yes." The bus doors folded shut. Diesel breath washed over her coat, warm for 1 second and then gone. She stood at the roadside until the bus became a yellow shape between trees. Then a sound, then nothing. The map from the clerk said 5.8 miles. It was farther. Not in distance maybe, but in the way a road can lengthen when walked under weight. Her suitcase dragged badly where the patched wheel caught gravel. After the first mile, she took the folder from beneath her arm and slid it under her shirt against the folded rug panel. After the second, she stopped beside a ditch and retied the twine around the suitcase wheel. Her fingers had stiffened from cold, and the knot took 3 attempts before it held. The day warmed only a little. At noon, a thermometer outside a feed co-op read 38 degrees, though the wind made a thinner number of it. Thea bought nothing. She stood under the awning long enough to eat 1 hard-boiled egg from the sack the mission woman had given her, breaking the shell into her pocket so she would not leave it on the ground. By late afternoon, the sky lowered. She had not reached the property, she had not reached the town. The map had not shown the rise and drop of the land, the narrow shoulder, the places where the road curved blind against stone and made her step into weeds until trucks passed. Near sundown she came upon the hay barn she had seen from the bus, only from the far side now, its open bay facing away from the road toward a pasture dull with winter grass. There was no house near it. Thea stood outside the barn for some time, listening. No voices. No dog. No chain dragging from a post. Just the low click of dry grass, the settling of boards, and a wind that came through cracks with the smell of dust and old feed. She slept there because she could not keep walking in the dark. Inside, hay bales were stacked against the north wall, not fresh, but dry enough to make a hollow between them and the siding. She placed her suitcase first, then crawled after it, pulling loose hay over her legs. The temperature fell to 29 before midnight. She knew because a small round thermometer had been nailed to a beam near the door. Its white face cracked but readable in the moonlight. Cold came up from the earth with a patience that felt older than weather. Thea slept in pieces. An hour, then less. Once she woke to the sound of something small moving in the hay and she kept still until it passed. Once headlights rolled over the boards and every gap in the wall burned white for a breath. She held the deed inside her coat and listened to a truck slow, then climb away. Near dawn, she dreamed Ruthie was beating down a row of knots. The beater made a wooden sound. Thack, thack, thack. When Thea opened her eyes, the sound was a loose piece of tin lifting and settling in the wind. She rose before the first colour came into the sky. Her hands looked older than they had the night before. Dry lines crossed her knuckles. Hay clung to her coat and hair. She brushed herself as clean as she could, drank from the water bottle she had filled at the library, and stepped back onto the road while the fields were still blue with frost. The town appeared without announcing itself. A green highway sign gave its name first, then a speed limit of 25, then a row of structures gathered along the road as if they had moved closer together for warmth. There was a hardware store with red-painted trim and sacks of lime stacked under the front window. Beside it stood a cafe called Doris's Morning Table, where two men in work jackets sat at the counter and steam clouded the glass. Across the street, a barber shop displayed a striped pole that no longer turned, a used book room occupied the front of an old pharmacy, and a feed and seed kept bushel baskets outside even in cold weather, filled with onions, seed potatoes and apples going soft at the stem. Farther down, a laundromat hummed behind a row of fogged windows. A church with white clapboard siding stood on a rise, its signboard missing 2 letters from the Sunday sermon. The post office was the smallest building on the block, brick-faced and exact, with an American flag snapping against a pale morning sky. Thea stopped on the sidewalk. She had imagined the place abandoned, not simply overlooked. The difference unsettled her. Abandoned meant nobody saw you arrive. Overlooked meant people noticed and waited to decide what kind of person you were. The cafe door opened, and warm air came out carrying the smell of bacon, yeast rolls, coffee, and something sweet with cinnamon. Thea looked in without meaning to. A woman behind the counter lifted her chin in greeting, not smiling fully, but not turning away. Thea lowered her eyes first. Hunger had become easier to manage than kindness. The county clerk's branch office sat at the far end of the block in a former bank with limestone blocks around the door. The brass night deposit slot remained beside the entrance, though it had been painted shut. Inside, the lobby still held the proportions of money: high ceiling, marble wainscoting, a teller counter converted into service windows, and a round clock set above an iron vault door that now stood open to reveal shelves of land records. The air smelled of paper, old heat, and the faint peppery scent of copier toner. Thea stepped inside and wiped her shoes twice on the mat. A bell rang somewhere beyond the counter. Though no one had touched it, the building was not busy. One older man stood reading a tax notice under the clock. A mother filled out a form while a boy in a camouflage jacket turned his cap around and around in his hands. Behind the glass, a woman in a green cardigan was aligning stacks of documents with precise taps against the counter. Her nameplate read MRS. Alma Crowell. She was small but not slight, with silver hair pinned into a low roll and hands that moved confidently over paper. Her glasses hung from a chain of dark beads. A narrow gold ring sat loose at the base of one finger, and when she looked up she did it slowly, giving Thea the full courtesy of being seen. "You came from Asheville," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am?" Mrs. Crowell reached for the wheat-coloured folder before Thea had removed it from her coat. "I thought you might. That filing came through late yesterday." Thea slid the papers across the counter. Mrs. Crowell opened them. "Read the top sheet, then the second." She did not hurry. Her lips moved faintly over the parcel number. When she reached the purchase amount, she paused, not with surprise exactly, but with a kind of sadness that had learned manners. "You have identification?" Thea produced it. The clerk compared the card to her face, then to the folder, then back again. A fluorescent light buzzed above them. Somewhere behind the counter, a printer woke, ran 2 sheets, and fell silent. "Mrs.?" Crowell folded her hands on the document. "Before I stamp this transfer," she said, "you need to understand what you're taking on." "Yes." "Ma'am, the structure is not certified for occupancy." "Yes." "Ma'am, there is no active electrical service." "Yes." "Ma'am, The well has not been tested since the county closed the file. Yes, ma'am. The roof was listed as partially failed in the last inspection. Yes, ma'am. And if the place injures you, the county will not carry that sorrow for you. Thea looked at the woman's hands, at the loose ring, at the clean half-moons of her nails. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Crowell waited as if there might be another answer beneath that one. When none came, she drew the top page nearer and placed a yellow tab beside a signature line. You understand the purchase includes contents only insofar as they remain attached or abandoned on site. No warranty of value. No claim against the county for missing, damaged, or hazardous materials. Yes, ma'am. You understand there are back taxes due, though not many. $43.12. They will come due after the transfer posts. Thea's throat moved. Yes. Ma'am? You understand that demolition had already been scheduled for spring, and this filing interrupts that process only if the new owner assumes responsibility before the final notice. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Crowell took off her glasses. The room seemed to quiet around the absence of them. Honey, she said, and the word came out plain, not soft enough to pity, not hard enough to scold. Do you have somewhere else to go if that roof gives way? Thea could have lied. The lie came near. It stood ready in her mouth wearing a clean dress. Instead she said, No. Ma'am? The clerk looked toward the open vault, where record books sat in rows older than both of them. She put her glasses back on. Then we will be exact. She turned the pages one by one. She explained the parcel boundary, the unpaid tax, the liability line, the demolition hold, the road access, the old water right that might or might not still matter, and the fact that the county had never located a septic record. She used a pencil to mark where Thea should sign and a square of blotting paper beneath the page to keep the ink from pressing through. Thea signed carefully. Her hand shook only once. Mrs. Crowell carried the document to a side table where an old brass embosser sat bolted to the wood. It was heavier than it looked, with the curved handle darkened by years of palms. The clerk aligned the page beneath the seal and pressed down with both hands. The metal gave a blunt, dignified sound. Not loud. Final. Then came the stamp. Red ink. Date. County. Book number. Page pending. Mrs. Crowell wrote a temporary receipt in blue ink and tore it along a perforation. She placed it in an envelope with the copied deed, a tax notice, a map, and a folded page of directions written by hand. Do not trust your telephone out there, she said. It loses service past the second bridge. Yes, ma'am. You follow Old Marshall Highway until it breaks left near the Holston mailbox. Not Holstein. Holston? The sign is crooked. After that, you take Shope Creek Road for a spell, then a gravel lane with 2 walnut trees on the right. If you reach the church cemetery, you have gone too far. Yes, ma'am. There is a dog at the yellow house before the lane. He makes a speech, but he is tied. Thea almost smiled. Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Crowell slid the envelope across the counter, then kept 2 fingers resting on it. What was your father's name? Thea went still. The question had not been written on any form Mrs. Crowell had read aloud. Rowan, she said after a moment. Rowan Whitlow. The clerk's eyes lifted. And Ruthie Whitlow. Thea's hand closed around the edge of the counter. She was my father's aunt. For the first time. Mrs. Crowell's careful office face changed. It did not open all at once. It loosened in one place, near the mouth, then settled into something older. I bought a runner from Ruthie in 1986, she said. Blue border, brown center, little white hooks in the corners. She told me those hooks were for holding a blessing in place. Thea looked down at the folder because looking at the woman was suddenly harder. She said that, Thea said. She used to come through here with wool in the back of that green wagon of hers. Hair pinned with 2 pencils, never one. My mother had one of her stair rugs. Wore near through by the time she passed. Thea could not answer. Mrs. Crowell removed her hand from the envelope. Then, from the drawer beneath her station, she took a small ruled card and wrote a telephone number. Her writing was compact, slanted, and firm. The hardware store is run by Orlan Pike. His father knew everyone who worked with wood, wool, iron, stubbornness in this county. He is not a charitable man in the manner people like to advertise, but he keeps accounts. Sometimes that is better. She tucked the card into the envelope. The cafe owner is Doris Bell. She watches without seeming to. If she asks whether you have eaten, answer plain, yes. Ma'am? Mrs. Crowell looked once more at the deed. I'm going to put your dollar in the drawer, she said. My dollar. The county requires symbolic consideration on certain surplus transfers after minimum bid. A single bill stays with the temporary record until posting. Most folks do not care which bill. Thea opened her handkerchief before remembering it was empty. Mrs. Crowell saw. After a long second, the clerk reached into her own purse, withdrew a worn $1 bill, and smoothed it on the counter. This one will do, she said. I can't take that. You are not taking it. The county is. Thea looked at the bill. It had a crease down the center and a tiny ink mark near Washington's shoulder. I will pay you back. I know, Mrs. Crowell said, though there was no reason for her to know such a thing. She placed the bill with the file, closed the folder, and wrote Thea's name on the tab. When Thea stepped back outside, the town had moved deeper into morning. The barber shop light was on. A delivery truck blocked half the street in front of the cafe. 2 women stood outside the post office talking with their arms folded against the cold. Thea could feel the envelope beneath her coat as a separate weight, thinner than hope, heavier than paper. She did not go into the cafe. Not yet. She followed the directions. Old Marshall Highway carried her out of town in a long bend above a creek. Cars passed seldom, and when they did, the drivers gave her room. On one side a bank rose steeply, veined with roots and stone. On the other, winter fields sloped toward water, their grasses flattened silver by frost that had not melted where the sun could not reach. She passed a repair garage with 3 trucks in various stages of being returned to usefulness, a white house with blue shutters, and a roadside stand closed for the season. Its painted sign promising tomatoes, sorghum, quilts, and boiled peanuts. At the Holston mailbox, the road sign leaned exactly as Mrs. Crowell had said. Shoke Creek Road narrowed after the turn. The pavement lost its center line. A black dog at the yellow house gave a fierce formal account of her arrival, hurling himself to the end of his chain, and then stopping short with practiced outrage. His bark followed her past the fence, past a rusted bicycle, past 2 empty flower pots on a porch rail. Morning, she said to him, because he had done his duty well. Beyond the yellow house, the road changed from paved to gravel without ceremony. The first walnut tree stood on the right, wide-limbed and bare, with last year's blackened hulls pressed into the mud beneath it. The second stood 20 yards farther, split once by lightning but alive. Its trunk seamed around the wound. Between them a lane entered the trees. No sign marked it. Thea stopped. She took the map from the envelope and unfolded it against her thigh. Gravel. Creek. 2 walnut trees. Boundary line beginning at an iron pin no longer visible. Former structure indicated by square. The lane curved downhill through brush and laurel, then rose slightly. Her suitcase struck stones and roots. Once it tipped and spilled sideways. and she stood breathing through her nose until the first sharp heat of frustration passed. Then she set it upright and went on. At the end of the lane, the building waited in a clearing the size of a held breath. It was narrower than she had imagined and taller, built of weathered oak planks gone grey with age. The lower courses darker where rain had risen from the ground year after year. The front was 22 feet wide by Thea's count, with a centre door and 2 windows, one boarded, one cracked in a branching line from corner to corner. The length ran back perhaps 38 feet toward the trees. A stone chimney leaned at the rear, not much, but enough for the eye to notice and keep noticing. The roof was cedar shake under patches of rusted tin. Moss had grown thick along the north slope. The west eave sagged as if a tired shoulder had lowered there and never lifted. A narrow porch crossed half the front, its boards cupped and silvered, one step missing, the railing gone except for 2 posts. Above the door hung the sign, not painted anymore, not truly. The letters had faded into the grain, but Thea could still make them out where shadow held the strokes. Whitlow Rugworks. She read it standing in the lane. Then she read it again. The name did not strike like thunder. It entered slowly, with a coldness more precise than weather. Whitlow, not Ruthie's shed, not Rowan's house. Another branch of the same route, or perhaps an older one, reaching underground where no one in her family had thought to look. A rusted hasp hung from the door, but no padlock held it. The county tag was stapled beside the frame, in a plastic sleeve clouded by rain. Unsafety structure. N.O. Empry. Thea touched the sleeve with 2 fingers. The plastic cracked. She did not go in at once. She walked around the outside first, because her father would have done that, and because Ruthie would have said a place deserved the courtesy of being approached from all sides before a person began asking things of it. The north wall stood close to rhododendron and wild grape. A gutter hung loose at one corner. Under the rear eave, a stack of split wood had rotted into itself, bark and heartwood returning to one dark substance. The chimney stones were large, some field stone, some cut, with mortar missing near the crown. At the back, a narrow door stood swollen in its frame. Beside it, a tin wash basin hung on a nail. It had collected rainwater, leaves, and 1 pale feather. Thea came around to the front again. The clearing was still, not silent. No place outside is silent if a person has become poor enough to listen. There was creek water somewhere below the slope, hidden but steady. There were crows beyond the trees. There was the dry rub of branches against one another. There was her own breath. She climbed the porch by stepping over the missing board. The wood flexed under her weight, then held. The door resisted. She pushed with her shoulder. The swollen edge scraped the frame, gave half an inch, caught, then gave again with a sound that seemed less like opening than being woken from a long, unwilling sleep. Cold air moved out around her, carrying dust, mouse leavings, dry wool, mildew, and something faintly sweet like old cedar. The front room received her without welcome and without refusal. Light entered through the cracked window and through gaps in the boards, making narrow visible paths across the air. Dust turned slowly in those paths. The floor was white pine, worn grey in the centre, where feet had once crossed often, darker near the walls. On the left stood a counter made of oak boards, its top scarred by knife marks and ink rings. Behind it, shelves held glass jars clouded by age, some empty, some filled with buttons, tacks, wooden pegs, and metal hooks darkened with rust. A pot-bellied stove sat near the chimney on a square of blackened brick. Its pipe rose crookedly, then vanished into the wall. Beside it stood a chair with a cane seat broken through at the centre. A calendar still hung near the counter, March 1999. The photograph above the dates showed a waterfall in spring flood, white water caught in permanent descent. Thea set her suitcase just inside the door. The sound it made on the floor was too loud. She waited afterward, though for what she could not have said. Collapse. Movement. A voice. Some final refusal from the building itself. None came. She stepped farther in. The smell changed with each part of the room, near the counter paper and dust, near the stove, old ash and iron, near the corner shelves, wool and cedar. Her boot sole stuck once to a patch where varnish or sap had long ago spilled and hardened. She bent to touch it, then thought better and straightened. There were signs of departure, but not completion. A ledger lay closed under a film of dust. A teacup sat upside down on a saucer. 3 broom straws had been caught beneath the edge of a floor mat. Whoever had left had expected, or pretended, to return. A doorway without a door led to the back room. Thea stood at its threshold for several breaths. The loom filled the far wall. It rose nearly to the rafters, 6 feet across and higher than she could reach, made of oak darkened by oil, hands, smoke, and years. Its upright posts were squared and thick, the beams held, though the lower one had bowed slightly. Warp threads still ran through it, hundreds of them, dulled from white to the colour of unbleached bone. Some had snapped and curled, others remained taut, as if refusing to accept that the last hand had gone. Around the room stood racks of yarn, not in order anymore, not fully, but still arranged by old intention. Reds in one section, from brick to madder to a dry rose faded by light. Blues from indigo to storm cloud, greens like moss, bottle glass, hemlock and pond shadow, browns, golds, blacks, creams, cotton cord hung in loops from wooden pegs. Bundles of wool sat wrapped in paper gone brittle at the edges. A handwritten tag on one shelf reads Sumac, OCT, 1976. Thea did not touch anything. Her hands had gone still at her sides. On a work table lay tools whose names came back before she reached for them. Beater, shuttle, shears, curved knife, warp separator, a narrow awl with a polished handle. There were wooden bobbins in a shallow tray and a tin of rusted pins. Beneath the table, mouse-chewed paper had gathered in soft grey drifts. The back window had lost most of its glass. Wind moved through it and stirred loose wool fibres along the floor. The room felt colder than the front, but cleaner somehow, kept by the very draught that had ruined it. A beam of late afternoon light angled across the loom and rested on the warp beam where 2 dull brass circles capped the ends. Thea noticed them only as part of the whole. A beautiful machine. A damaged room. A place that had held work longer than anyone had held a claim. She moved through the inventory with the caution of a guest. 1 shelf, 1 table, 1 corner. At the rear wall she found a narrow cupboard containing folded cloth, a cracked enamel basin, 3 jars of nails, and a bundle of candles tied with string. Most had warped from heat. 1 remained straight enough to use. She also found a tin matchbox with 6 matches, 2 broken, 4 whole. In a drawer beneath the work table, there was a folded feed sack, clean enough inside to serve as a pillow cover, a coil of rope, a wooden ruler, a pencil sharpened short. No food, no blanket. Near the stove, she opened the ash door and saw pale, dry ash inside. That was mercy. At least rain had not entered the flue badly enough to drown it. She did not try for a fire. Not yet. Chimneys were not to be trusted simply because cold hands wanted them to be. The day fell quickly after that. Mountain dusk did not descend in a single motion. It gathered first under tables behind shelves, in the corners where the walls met the floor. Then it climbed. Thea carried loose boards from the porch edge and wedged them across the broken back window, not to stop the cold, only to soften it. She found 2 burlap sacks in the cupboard and shook them outside until dust rose like breath. Her first meal in the building was the 2nd hard-boiled egg, half the biscuit, and water. She ate sitting on the floor with her back against the counter. The biscuit had gone dry. She softened each bite in her mouth before swallowing. The room darkened until the cracked window became a pale shape and then no shape at all. Night inside the shop was different from night in the hay barn. The barn had belonged to animals, tools, weather, and whoever owned the field. It had tolerated her. This building seemed to be listening. Every board had a memory of weight. Every shelf held the shape of a removed hand. When the wind pressed against the wall, the whole structure answered in small exact sounds. A click near the door, a sigh above the rafters, a faint ticking from the stovepipe as metal cooled further into darkness. Thea made her bed in the front room because the floor there seemed strongest. She spread the burlap sacks beneath her coat, placed the folded feed sack under her head, and kept the suitcase on the side nearest the door. The folder went inside the suitcase. Ruthie's unfinished panel stayed against her chest. She lay on her back and watched the ceiling fade from grey to black. The cold arrived in layers, first her feet, then her knees, then the place between her shoulder blades where the floor pressed hardest. She tucked her hands beneath her arms, but the fingers remained awake, listening to their own pulse. Outside, the creek kept speaking below the hill. Once a branch struck the roof and rolled down the slope of shakes with a dry scrape that made her sit up before she understood it. No one knew she was there. The thought did not frighten her as much as it should have. It made the room larger but also simpler. No one was waiting to lock a door. No one was lowering their eyes from a hallway. No one was weighing the value of her presence against property. There was danger, yes. Rot, cold, bad water, a chimney that might smoke her out, or worse. But danger was different from being unwanted. It had edges, it could be studied. Near midnight, moonlight entered through the cracked glass and reached the opposite wall in a broken pattern. It touched the calendar, the counter, the top of her suitcase, then stopped short of the doorway to the loom room. Thea listened until her hearing adjusted past the building itself and found the faintest sound from the back. Warp threads moving in the draft, a dry whisper fibre against fibre. She did not sleep deeply. But she slept. Toward morning, she woke with her cheek numb against the feed sack and saw the first weak blue of dawn standing in the window. For a moment, before memory arranged itself, she did not know where she was. Then the smell came to her. Ash, cedar, wool, damp pine. The shop. The deed. The brass stamp. The name above the door. She sat up slowly. Her breath showed pale before her face. Her coat was stiff at the hem. One mouse, bold with cold, crossed beneath the counter and vanished behind a box of empty jars. Thea watched it go without moving. The front room had survived the night. So had she. She rose, folded the burlap sacks, and carried the candle from the cupboard to the counter where the morning light could find it. She did not light it. Not yet. Day was enough for now. In the back room, the loom stood in the blue-grey hour before sunrise, its warp threads faint and vertical, like rain held still. Thea stepped to the threshold and placed one hand against the doorframe. The wood was cold. She stayed there until the first sun touched the brass caps on the warp beam and made them glow for one narrow second. Not brightly. Not like treasure. Only like something honest, briefly answering the light. The house was not empty. It had been waiting. By the third morning, Thea knew which floorboards could be trusted before sunrise. The first one inside the door complained under any weight, even a careful foot. The two near the counter held firm if crossed close to the wall. The plank before the stove had a hollow give beneath it. Not rot exactly, but old loosening. The kind made by years of heat drying one side while ground damp worked at the other. In the back room, the safest path ran along the right-hand wall, past the yarn racks, then across a narrow strip of floor where someone had once laid boards thicker than the rest. She learned this by listening. A house speaks differently when it is about to fail than when it is merely old. Her father had said that once while kneeling under a porch with a flashlight between his teeth, bad wood thudded. Sound wood answered. Loose wood rattled. Wet wood swallowed noise and gave nothing back. Thea carried that knowledge into the shop, the way a person carries matches in cold weather. On the first day she did almost nothing that could be mistaken for improvement. She walked the rooms and made notes on the back of the county envelope with Ruthie's short pencil from the drawer. She marked broken glass, soft boards, missing mortar, mouse holes, damp corners, roofline sag, and the place where the back door did not meet its frame. She opened cupboards only after tapping them first. She moved no heavy object. She lifted no beam, no shelf, no tool that had found its own balance over time. Outside, she searched for the well. It stood 28 paces behind the shop, beyond the rotted woodpile and down a shallow slope, capped by a square of poured concrete with an iron hand pump rising from the centre. The handle was stiff and orange with rust at the hinge. A tin cup hung from a nail in the pump post, its bottom freckled through with pinholes. Thea did not drink. She worked the handle once and heard a cough of air from underground, then nothing, again nothing. On the 7th pull, water came up brown and startled, spat from the spout, then ran clear enough to shine before clouding in the cold basin below. She filled a glass jar and held it to the light. No obvious insects. No oil skin. No smell of sulphur. But water can look innocent and still carry old harm. She set the jar on the back step to settle and marked the well untested on her list. The outhouse stood farther uphill, half hidden by mountain laurel and a young poplar growing too close to one corner. Its door hung by one hinge. The roof had kept most rain out, and cold had held down the worst of the smell. Inside a wasp nest the size of a fist clung empty to the rafters. Thea swept the seat, not because sweeping made it safe, but because cleanliness was one way of telling panic it would not be allowed to govern. She slept little that first night after Dawn found her. Every unknown part of the property took turns knocking at her mind. The well? The chimney? The tax notice? The roof? The soft place near the stove? The back window patched with loose boards? She dreamed of water rising through floor seams and woke to a mouse chewing somewhere behind the counter. On the second day, she searched the shop for useful things. She found a broom missing half its straw but still willing, a dented bucket, a crate of empty jars, 2 hinges, 1 box of cut nails gone rusty but not ruined, a chipped enamel pot, 3 burlap sacks, 2 wool blankets folded inside a cedar chest in the back room, both smelling strongly of camphor and mouse. She carried them outside, shook them hard, and hung them over a low branch in the sun. Dust rose, a dead moth fell out. She shook them again. At noon she boiled well water in the enamel pot over a small fire, made outside in a ring of stones, using dry twigs from beneath the porch and the 4 good matches from the tin. She let the water boil for 10 minutes because she did not know what else to trust. The taste was flat and metallic, but it was water. She drank slowly, waiting between swallows. That afternoon, she cleaned the front room enough to sit without resting her hands in dust. She swept from the corners inward gathered mouse droppings with a scrap of cardboard, tied them inside one of the brittle paper bags, and carried them outside. She moved the broken chair to the porch. She wiped the counter with boiled water and an old rag made from the feed sack. The stain on the wood darkened, then dried lighter. On the 3rd day, she walked back to town. She started before full daylight, because the distance would take more from her if she waited. The road seemed shorter now that she knew its turns, though her body disagreed. Hunger had become a hollow discipline. She had eaten the last half of the biscuit the night before, and saved the apple core only until shame made her finish it. The black dog at the yellow house made his speech again. This time he stopped sooner. "Morning," Thea said. The hardware store smelled like seed packets, pipe tobacco, oiled metal and wood dust. A brass bell above the door rang when she entered, though its spring was weak and gave only one dull note. The floorboards had been painted brown long ago and worn through in narrow paths from the door to the counter, from the counter to the nail bins, from the nail bins to the back room where lumber stood upright in racks. Glass jars of screws lined one wall, axe handles hung from the rafters, galvanized buckets nested near the stove, and a tower of stovepipe sections leaned in the corner like blackened organ pipes. Behind the counter stood Orlan Pike. He was broad through the shoulders and narrow at the waist in the way of men who had carried sacks for 50 years without calling it exercise. His hair was white, cut close, and one eyebrow had a scar through it that made it rise at the end, giving his face a permanent look of patient doubt. He wore a brown canvas apron over a flannel shirt, and his hands were cracked dark around the nails from oil, lime, and weather. He looked at Thea, then at her shoes, then at the envelope under her arm. "You bought the Whitlow place," he said. "Yes." Alma called. Thea had not known whether to be grateful or afraid of that. She chose neither and stood still. Orlin took a pencil from behind his ear. You got money? No. Tools. Some. That means no. Yes. The corner of his mouth moved, not toward a smile, only toward acknowledgement. What are you trying to do first? Not die in it? This time he did almost smile. That is a sensible order. He came around the counter and walked with a slight outward turn of his right foot, leading her down an aisle between rope tarps and paint cans. He did not speak in the soft voice people sometimes used when they had noticed poverty and wanted to make themselves feel kind. He spoke as if poverty were weather, serious, inconvenient, not improved by embarrassment. Roof later unless water is pouring in. Chimney before fire. Windows before freeze if you can. Well needs testing, but boiling buys time. Floorboards you avoid until you have light and lumber. You know how to work? Yes. Not asking if you're willing, asking if you know. Thea looked at a row of hammers hanging by their claws. Some. My father repaired things. My grandmother taught me rug work. Ruthie did not teach fools, Orlin said. That is something. He took her to the back counter and pulled out a school notebook, black and white marbled, the kind sold for $25 years ago. On the cover, in blue marker, she wrote Whitlow account. I do not carry strangers, he said. No. You are not quite stranger. She kept her eyes on the notebook. I cannot promise when I can pay. I did not ask when. I will ask every month whether you're still alive and still working. If both answers are yes, account stays open. I don't want charity. Good. I dislike handing it out. Credit is different. Credit expects you to stand up again. He tore a sheet from a pad and began writing. First rule. Do not light that stove until the chimney is cleaned and drafted. Second rule. Do not climb the roof alone. Third rule. Do not drink that well raw until the county or somebody with a kit tells you to. Fourth rule. If a floor gives under one heel, it will take your whole leg next time. Yes. He reached under the counter and brought up a thick paperback with a faded orange cover. Homestead Repairs for Plain Houses, 190/72 edition. A strip of duct tape held the spine together. Several pages had been marked with folded corners. My father sold these for $1.50, he said. This one lost its price tag and most of its dignity. You can have it. I can pay later. You can return it dirty. He set it beside the notebook. Then he began collecting what he called the first list, which meant the list a person made before reality corrected it. Work gloves, 1 pair. Women's small, $3.79. Dust masks, pack of 5, $1.49. Wire chimney brush, 6-inch round, $4.95 used because the handle had been bent and straightened. 2 5-foot fiberglass rods, $1.25 each. A flat scraper, 79 cents. Cotton sash cord remnants, no charge because they were too short for anyone with proper windows. A box of 8D common nails, £1, 91 cents. A box of 6D finish nails, £1/2, 64 cents. Roll of black roofing felt with torn edge, $2. 1 cake of lye soap, 25 cents. Kerosene lamp chimney, cracked at the lip but usable, 40 cents. A bottle of lamp oil, $1.10. A bundle of kindling from the scrap bin, no charge if she carried it herself. Thea watched the numbers gather. They are too much, she said. They are what they are. I cannot take all that today. No, Orlin said. Today you take brush, rods, scraper, masks, gloves, lamp oil, and soap. Fire before beauty, breathing before floors. He wrote each item into the notebook with slow block letters, then turned it around for her to see. The total looked impossible and modest at the same time. $15.07. Thea had owned less than that for weeks. Seeing it as debt made her stomach tighten, but Orlan capped his pencil and placed it behind his ear. "You sign here." She signed. Her name looked thin on his page. He folded the dust masks into the gloves, tied the rods with twine, and found a flour sack for the smaller things. When she lifted the bundle, the chimney brush bristles pricked through the cloth. "At the door," she said. "Wither holds 2 days. Clean while it is dry." "Yes." "And girl?" She turned. "Creosote falls like black glass. Do not look up with your mouth open." She nodded once, because that deserved more than politeness. The walk back took longer with the rods over one shoulder. Doris from the cafe was sweeping the sidewalk when Thea passed. She did not ask where Thea had been or where she was going. She only reached into her apron pocket and held out a biscuit wrapped in wax paper. "Made too many," she said. Thea knew that was not true. "Thank you. Eat it before it turns mean." Thea did while walking. At the shop, she set the hardware supplies on the counter and opened the repair book to the chimney chapter. She read it once standing, once sitting, and once aloud in the front room so the words would slow down enough to be useful. Cleaning a chimney was not merely sending a brush upward and hoping for virtue. First, she cleared the stove box, scooping ash into the bucket with a piece of flat tin. Then she detached the stovepipe by loosening 2 rusted screws with the awl from the work table, though one screw head broke and left half its body inside the collar. The pipe came free with a cough of soot that darkened her sleeves. She carried each section outside and tapped it gently with a stick until black flakes fell onto newspaper weighted by stones. Creosote looked like burnt sugar and broken shale. It was light in some places, hard in others, glossy where it had glazed from years of slow smoke cooling against cold masonry. Orlan had been right. It fell sharp. She tied a dust mask behind her head, wrapped a rag around her hair, and covered the stove opening with a wet feed sack while she worked from below. The chimney brush resisted at the first bend, then climbed when she twisted the rods clockwise, never counter. The book warned unless she wanted the threads to loosen and leave the brush trapped in darkness above her reach. Up 5 feet. Down 2. Twist. Up again. The sound inside the flue was a dry grinding. Bristle against soot, soot against brick, brick answering in a muffled scrape. Every few minutes she withdrew the brush and let debris fall into the stove opening. Black dust found the edges of the mask. It settled on her eyelashes. It made half-moons beneath her nails. Her shoulders began to burn before the first hour ended. She worked 4 hours that day and 3 the next morning. After each pass, she changed the angle slightly, feeling for corners inside the flue. She used the flat scraper where the lower throat had built a hard ridge. She reached through the stove opening with her arm wrapped in cloth and scraped until her wrist cramped. Twice she stopped because dizziness came near. She went outside, breathed cold air, drank boiled water, and looked at the creek flashing between trees until the black motes in her vision cleared. By afternoon of the second day, the brush moved more freely. When she held a mirror from the cupboard below the flue, she could see a narrow grey rectangle of sky above. Not clean. Not safe by the standards of any inspector, but open. She carried the last bucket of soot outside and buried it away from the well. Then she rebuilt the pipe. One joint remained loose, so she packed it with stove cement from a half-dried tub found behind the counter, working it in with the putty knife until it sealed as well as old material could. She opened the front door, the back door, and the cracked window. She placed 3 small sticks in the stove, a twist of paper from the county envelope edge, and 1 shaving of cedar from a broken shelf. Her hand shook when she struck the match. The first flame did not catch. The second bent low, blew at its root, then took the paper. Smoke rose, hesitated, and for one long breath, Thea saw it gather inside the stove like a thought deciding whether to stay. Then it pulled upward. She watched through the open stove door as the draft found itself. The smoke leaned back into the pipe and vanished. The little sticks cracked. Flame climbed, not high, not greedy, just enough. Heat touched her face with such plain kindness that she had to look away and busy herself with the enamel pot. Her first hot meal in the shop was cornmeal mush made from a paper sack Orlan had added without listing it. Stirred into boiled water with a pinch of salt found in a jar behind the counter, she ate it from the chipped mug because the enamel pot was too hot to hold. It tasted of smoke, iron and grain. It tasted like staying. That night she fed the fire carefully, one stick at a time, never enough to test the chimney beyond its patience. The room warmed by degrees, not into comfort but into survival. Frost did not gather on the inside of the window, her hands stopped hurting. The wool blankets, aired for 2 days, held heat over her legs. For the first time, she slept 3 hours without waking. After fire came inventory. Thea began in the front room because that was where commerce had once stood. She cleared the counter and made columns in the notebook. Orlan had given her keep, clean, repair, undown. The ledger under the dust was too fragile to open fully, so she eased only the cover back and read the first line. April 3rd, 1981, runner, blue border, M. Crowell, paid in full. She closed it. Not from fear, from respect. On the shelves she found 12 glass jars of buttons sorted by material: bone, shell, brass, black glass, covered wood. 3 jars of tacks, 2 ruined by rust, a box of paper tags with string loops, 6 folded patterns drawn on graph paper, a cloth measuring tape with one end torn, a tin cash box containing no money, only receipts, a pencil and a small smooth stone wrapped in tissue. On the tissue someone had written, French Broad River, flood year. The back room took 2 days. She counted yarn by shelf and shade, tying loose labels where the old ones had fallen. Wool first, cotton next. Linen cord, warp thread, dye packets hardened into bricks, alum in a jar, iron mordant in a bottle with a cork blackened at the neck. She found bundles of walnut hulls dried hard as carved wood, onion skins in a flour sack, and madder root wrapped in newspaper dated 1993. The tools she laid on the work table in order. 2 beaters, 1 heavy, 1 lighter, 3 shuttles, 4 pairs of shears, only 1 still sharp. Ruthie had called them rug shears, though these were wider and older, with handles worn bright where fingers had passed through for years. A curved weaving knife, its blade short and wickedly exact. A wooden comb, a reed hook, a warp separator, and all 4 bobbins, 1 brass thimble dented at the crown. A spool rack missing 2 pegs. A wooden stool with 1 leg repaired by someone who had known enough to do it honestly but not prettily. On the 3rd shelf from the floor, she found 30 small squares of cardboard, each punched with holes along the top edge and marked in pencil, pattern records. Some were too faded to read. Some carried names like Bear Path, Meeting House Star, River Bend, Widow's Window, Cornflower Cross, Laurel Step. Thea did not yet know what to do with those names. She copied them anyway. The loom itself she left for last. It deserved daylight. More than that, it deserved courage that had been fed and warmed. She swept around its feet, cleared mouse paper from beneath the lower beam, and studied the frame without touching. The oak posts were mortised and pegged. The side braces had been tightened with wooden wedges. The lower cloth beam held a roll of unfinished foundation, not a rug but the beginning of one, perhaps abandoned after only 2 inches of knots. The warp threads rose from the lower beam through the working face and over the top, then back toward the rear beam. The warp beam was thicker than she expected. At first that meant nothing. Older looms were built heavy. Appalachian workshops borrowed from many traditions, and practical makers often overbuilt what they needed to last. But when she leaned near to inspect the tension, her knuckles brushed one end of the beam and heard a sound that did not belong. Not solid oak. A faint ring answered under the wood. Thea straightened. She tapped again, once with her knuckle, once with the wooden handle of the awl. The sound was low, but open. She moved to the center of the beam and tapped there. Duller, then to the opposite end. Open again. She stood with the awl in her hand while the back room gathered around her. Sound test. Her father would have said, "Do not decide from one answer." She took the small hammer from the tool drawer and tapped along the length. Not hard. Never hard enough to bruise old wood. Near both ends, the note changed. Beneath the grain was space. Next came weight. She had no scale, so she used touch angle and the patient arithmetic of leverage. The beam should have held the pull of hundreds of warp threads with the settled heaviness of a solid cylinder. Yet when she released the side brake slightly and lifted at the capped end, the beam answered too readily, not light, but wrong for its girth. There was weight inside it, yes, but not the continuous weight of oak. At each end sat a brass cap. She had noticed them at dawn. Now she saw what she had missed. They were not decorative plates. Each was a fitted disc, tarnished dark around the rim, secured by 4 tiny brass screws. The slots were narrow and filled with grime. Around the edge of one cap, a line of wax or old pitch had dried almost black. Thea did not open it that day. That restraint surprised her. Need had made so many decisions urgent that patience felt almost luxurious. But the beam was under tension, and a careless hand could ruin the warp, the frame, or whatever lay hidden if hidden was the right word. She spent the rest of the afternoon drawing the assembly in Orland's notebook, labelling the brake, the side supports, the wedges, the screws, the beam angle, and the path of the threads. Then she walked to town the next morning to ask for a screwdriver fine enough to fit. Orland listened without expression while she described the brass caps. Could be repair access, he said. Yes. Could be somebody hiding liquor. Yes. Could be mice. Yes. He opened a drawer of small tools and selected 3 screwdrivers, laying them on the counter by size. Then he added a small bottle of penetrating oil, a toothbrush, and a strip of soft leather. Do not strip brass screws, he said. They are proud and weak. Yes. Oil? Wait. Clean the slot. Press down more than you turn. If it does not move, stop before you make it worse. Yes? He looked at her then. You found something? I found a question. That is usually how it starts. Back at the shop, she did exactly as he had said. She set a folded blanket beneath the beam to catch anything that might fall. She loosened the warp tension by 1 notch only. She brushed each screw head with the toothbrush until the slots appeared. She touched them with a drop of oil and waited an hour, during which she swept the front step. Not because it mattered, but because waiting needed a task. The first screw turned with a faint cry. The second resisted. She pressed harder, not turning, just seating the blade until her palm ached. Then she tried again. It gave. The third came loose easily. The fourth broke free all at once and nearly fell, but she caught it in the leather strip. When the screws lay in a jar lid beside her, the brass cap remained fixed. Wax held the rim. She warmed the blade of the weaving knife near the stove, not hot enough to scorch, only warm enough to soften age. Then she worked it around the cap seam with the care of lifting pastry from a pan. The dark seal cracked in short lines. A smell of beeswax and cedar rose from the opening. The cap came away. Behind it was not emptiness at once, but a fitted cedar disc set inside the hollow end of the beam. A finger hole had been drilled at its center and plugged with wool. Thea removed the wool plug and found it still red beneath the dust. Madder red? She put it in the jar lid with the screws. The cedar disc slid free when she hooked it with the awl. Inside the beam, wrapped tight and nested lengthwise, lay packages. Thea sat back on her heels. For several minutes, she touched nothing. The room had become very still, though the same draughts moved. The same creak spoke below the hill. The same stove settled in the front room with small iron ticks. The difference was in Thea's own body. Her hands had learned to move in hunger, in cold, in necessity. Now they refused to be hurried. She took out the first package with both hands. It was wrapped in oilcloth, tied with cotton string browned by time. The knot had hardened. She did not cut it. She loosened it slowly with the awl, easing each crossing until the string opened. Inside lay a set of heirloom weaving tools wrapped in linen, a curved knife finer than any on the table, its handle carved from walnut, a pair of small shears with blades still bright under grease, a bone shuttle smooth as water, a brass measuring gauge marked for knots per inch, and a wooden comb whose teeth had been cut by hand and worn shallow in the center from use. The second package held raw material, small skeins of wool dyed in colors deeper than those on the shelves, each labeled in brown ink: bloodroot, black walnut, indigo over-dyed, iron grey, sumac lake, pokeberry fugitive do not wash, butternut, cochineal gift from EM 1948. There were cotton warp bundles tied with blue thread, a roll of linen and several twists of silk so fine they seemed more like light than fibre. The third package was a stack of miniature rugs. She knew what they were before she unwrapped them fully. 12 inches by 12 inches, each one finished, bound and labelled on the back in careful handwriting. The first showed a stepped diamond in brown, blue and cream. The second carried a river line broken by small white hooks. The third held a dark centre square surrounded by red teeth like mountain laurel buds before bloom. 30 samples. Thea counted them twice without separating them more than necessary. Each had a note stitched or tied to it, some brief, some folded, each giving a name, source, and story. Cherokee basket echo, recorded from Mrs. A. Walkingstick, 1912. German coverlet star, adapted by Hester Whitlow, 1889. Scots Irish meeting house border, Madison County, no maker known. Enslaved weaver's broken chain motif, preserved in family cloth. Buncombe County, 1867. Thea's breath moved carefully. This was not inventory, it was not merchandise, it was a museum small enough to hide in 2 hands at a time, a record of women who had worked in cabins, sheds, settlement schools, porches, mills, rented rooms and back kitchens, a record of hands making beauty without waiting to be invited into history. The fourth package was a tin box. It was rectangular, the kind that had once held tea or sewing notions, with a faded, painted lid showing roses that had turned brown with age. Around it, someone had wrapped 2 strips of linen and tied them in a square knot. The tin had been sealed with wax at the lid. Thea did not open it in the back room. She carried it to the front counter, set it where light from the cracked window fell, and washed her hands with lye soap in boiled water until the black dust around her nails turned grey. Then she dried them on a clean corner of the feed sack, sat on the stool and broke the wax with the tip of the bone shuttle because she could not bring herself to use a knife. Inside was money. Not the way money appears in films, clean and bundled and waiting to make noise. This money lay in envelopes, cloth rolls, coin sleeves and folded bank wrappers gone soft along the seams. It smelled of paper, metal, cedar and time. Some bills were old series with small portraits and dark seals. Some were newer, as if the hiding had continued over years. The envelopes were labelled by month, by sale, by name, by purpose. Roof fund. Coal winter. Dye trip. For taxes. Do not spend unless keeping the place. Thea closed her eyes. Then she opened them because counting required witness. She made 3 columns in the notebook. Bills. Coins. Notes. The bills came first, 1s, 5s, 10s, 20s, and a few 50s, many worn, some crisp, all flattened by long storage. She sorted by denomination, then by envelope, preserving the labels beside each stack. Her hands moved slowly, touching each corner, smoothing folded edges, checking for brittleness. Twice she stopped to relight the lamp when the room darkened under passing clouds. The first total was too large, so she counted again. The second matched $48,900 in paper currency. The coins took longer. There were paper rolls of wheat pennies, most from the 1940s and 1950s, silver dimes, including Mercury's worn almost smooth, and Roosevelt dimes bright along the rims, Washington quarters dated before 1965, a cloth pouch of buffalo nickels, their dates mostly gone, 12 $half, 8 Walking Liberty, and 4 Franklin. 3 silver dollars, heavy and cold, 1 Morgan from 1921, 1 peace dollar from 1923, one-piece dollar from 1935. There were also newer coins, not many, added as if someone had continued the habit after silver disappeared from ordinary pockets. She counted face value first. Then she counted again, $700.37 in coins. At the bottom of the tin, wrapped in a square of blue wool, lay a medal. The ribbon had faded, but the bronze remained clear enough to read when she carried it to the window. It was a World War II victory medal, the year 1945 stamped on the paperwork folded with it. The name on the small card was Eli Whitlow, U.S. Army, returned by family, keep with house. Thea laid it on the counter apart from the money. Then she saw the final envelope. It had been placed flat beneath the tin's inner tray, hidden even within the hiding place. The paper had yellowed but held. Across the front, in ink browned nearly to rust, someone had written, "To the one who keeps the loom?" Thea did not open it. The refusal came from somewhere older than fear. Discovery had already filled the room past its walls. Money lay on the counter in careful stacks, coins caught dull light. 30 sample rugs rested on the clean blanket by the stove. Heirloom tools sat beside the lamp as if waiting for hands that knew how to ask permission. The letter remained under her palm, thin, sealed, and heavier than all of it. Not tonight. She put the money back into the tin in the same order, copying totals as she went. Paper currency, coins, medal, letter. But when she came to the letter, she stopped. She did not return it beneath the tray. She placed it on top of the tin, then wrapped the tin in linen and set it beside her bedroll. The exact total, written in Orland's notebook, came to $49,600.37. The number did not look like freedom. Not yet. It looked like responsibility placed in figures. It looked like taxes, roof, chimney, glass, flour, lamp oil, well testing, and years of work. It looked like someone before her had denied themselves comfort again and again, folding earned money into envelopes labeled not for pleasure, but for endurance. Outside, evening had gathered clear and cold. Thea left the tin on the counter, put on her coat, and walked down toward the creek. The path was not really a path, only a place where deer and water-seeking animals had passed often enough to teach the brush to bend. The ground fell steeply. Once she caught a rhododendron branch to keep from sliding. At the bottom the creek moved over flat stones, dark except where the last light touched it and broke into narrow pieces. She sat on a rock with her hands in her coat pockets. The water ran as if nothing in the world had changed. It moved over leaves, around stones, beneath a fallen branch furred with moss. It held no opinion about hidden money or names on deeds or women who signed papers with empty stomachs. It simply continued, exact and cold and alive. Thea stayed until her feet numbed. She watched one brown leaf turn in a small eddy, caught, released, caught again, then carried downstream above her. The shop was hidden by trees. No smoke rose because she had let the fire burn low before leaving. The sky went from pale grey to pewter to a blue so dark it seemed almost solid between the branches. She did not pray. She did not promise. She did not decide what kind of life would rise from the tin box, the sample rugs, the tools, the medal, the letter she had not read. Decisions made too soon often belonged more to fear than to truth. For now, she allowed the cold to enter her sleeves and the sound of water to steady the place behind her ribs where hunger and astonishment had begun to argue. When she finally climbed back to the shop, the front room was nearly dark. The lamp waited on the counter. The letter waited beside it. The loom stood beyond the doorway in the deeper black of the back room, its warp beam open at one end, its brass cap resting on the folded blanket with 4 tiny screws in a jar lid. Thea lit the lamp. She did not break the envelope. She wrapped herself in both wool blankets, lay down beside the tin, and listened through the walls to the creek, the wind, the settling roof, the faint dry whisper of warp threads shifting in the dark. The house was not empty. It had been waiting. This morning came without colour at first. Thea woke before the room had separated into objects, before the counter became a counter, and the stove became iron, and the doorway to the back room became a darker rectangle inside the dark. The tin box sat beside her bedroll wrapped in linen, square and patient. The letter lay on top of it exactly where she had left it, though in the half-light it seemed to have moved nearer. She sat up slowly. Cold had tightened the skin across her knuckles during the night. She worked her fingers once, twice, then folded the wool blankets back with care, as if waking too quickly might disturb not the room, but the time gathered inside it. The fire had gone out. A pale ash held the shape of the last stick. Outside, water moved below the hill with the same steady sound, and somewhere close to the eaves a bird gave one note, waited, gave another. The envelope was not sealed with wax. Only age held it shut. The paper was thick, cream-coloured once, now yellowed at the edges. It had been folded by someone who believed in straightness. Across the front, the ink had darkened to a brown so deep it seemed almost part of the paper itself. To the one who keeps the loom. Thea touched the words with one finger. She knew that hand. Not because she had seen it before, not exactly, but there was a family shape to the letters, the same long downward pull in the W, the same careful crossing of T's that her father had used when labelling jars of screws or writing notes beside repairs. Ruthie's writing had been smaller, more crowded, like a woman using every inch of paper because paper cost money. This hand was older than both and kin to them anyway. Thea carried the letter to the counter. She washed her hands first. Boiled water, Lee soap, a clean edge of cloth. Then she lit the lamp, though morning had begun to gather, because some things required more than daylight. She sat on the stool, slipped the bone shuttle beneath the envelope flap, and eased it open along the softened glue. The letter unfolded in 4 panels. The first line stood alone. My dear one, whoever you are, if this letter has found your hands, then the loom has outlived my voice, and perhaps that is a mercy. I'm writing from a room at Mission Hospital in Asheville on the 12th day of November, 1978, after Dr. Henry L. Carden told me plainly what my bones had already begun to know. The cancer is in my liver now. He spoke kindly, but kindness does not change the map once the roads have been drawn. I asked him for time enough to settle my accounts, and he said, Mrs. Whitlow, settle the ones that matter first. So I have come home to do that. My name is Hester May Whitlow, born Hester May Callahan in 1901, in a cabin above Reams Creek when the road was mud and the mail came when weather permitted. I was daughter to Eliza Ann Callahan, born 1874, who learned knotting from her mother, Sarai Bird, born 1848 near the Qualla boundary. Daughter of a Cherokee woman and a Scots trader who left more trouble than bread, Eliza married Jonah Whitlow in 1896, a wagon maker's son whose people came down from Pennsylvania by way of Virginia, carrying German coverlet drafts, Lutheran hymns, and a fear of debt so strong it might have been another child at the table. Their mothers did not share a language for all things, but they shared hands. From Sarai came the stepped water, the split diamond, the river cane echo, and the rule that a pattern must not be taken without naming its source when the source is known. From Jonah's mother, Martha Weiss Whitlow, came the star grids, meeting house borders, double hooks, and the thrift of using every thread down to its last obedient inch. My mother put them together, not because she wanted novelty, but because winter did not care whose grandmother had invented warmth. This loom was first raised in 1903 by Jonah and my mother, with oak cut from the West Ridge and pegs shaped by candlelight. I was 2 years old then and no help at all, though the family story says I slept in a basket under the work table while the posts were fitted. The shop opened properly in 1908. Rugs went by wagon to Asheville, then by rail when buyers could be found. Some were sold to hotels, some to churches, some to women who paid 50 cents a month and took the rug home only after the last coin was placed in my mother's hand. The trade closed on October 6th, 1948. I write that date so it will not be blurred by gossip or softened by shame. That morning a man from Knoxville came with 2 orders and left with none. He said machine rugs were cheaper, brighter, and arrived by catalogue without the stubbornness of mountain women attached to them. By noon, I had learned that 3 settlement school shops had stopped buying hand-knotted work. By evening, my brother Samuel had taken the last finished rug to town and brought it back unsold, rolled in brown paper like a body. We did not close because the work was poor. We closed because the world had learned to prefer quickness and call it progress. For more than 30 years after that day, the loom stood threaded. I told people I kept it so I could begin again when orders returned. That was partly true. A person can live a long while on partly true. I took mending, hemmed curtains, repaired quilts, sold vegetables, cleaned houses, taught 3 girls to tie knots before their husbands told them there was no money in it. I kept the sample rugs wrapped. I kept the pattern notes dry. I kept what cash I could spare inside the beam. Not because money is holy, but because a place without money is too easily taken by people who speak in official tones. My husband Eli Whitlow carried a rifle through France in the last year of the Great War, and came home with a cough that never respected summer. My son Thomas served in the Navy during the Second World War, and was buried at sea in 1945 after his ship took fire near Okinawa. My brother Samuel went to Korea with the army in 1951 and returned with 1 leg shorter in spirit, though both remained attached to his body. War took from this family in pieces, and each time the women put another meal on the table, another warp on the beam, another name into cloth. If you mean to work this loom, do not begin with pride. Begin with your hands washed, your tools sharp, and your temper laid outside the door. Keep wool dry but not brittle. If you wash fleece, hold the water between 105 and 110 degrees, never hotter, unless you mean to felt what you cannot unfelt. For dyeing with black walnut, use 1 pound of hulls to 1 pound of clean wool, and let the pot stand warm overnight before bringing it near a simmer. Do not boil wool in anger or haste. For madder, soak the root 12 hours, hold the bath below 180 degrees, and give it time to redden in its own way. A loom wants patience. 3 ounces to the pound dissolved clean before the wool goes in. Rinse until the water tells the truth. Set your warp with even tension, not tight like fear, not loose like surrender. A Giordi's knot must embrace 2 warp threads, pass around both, and come forward with equal legs. Pack each row with the beater after laying the weft, but do not beat so hard that the cloth loses breath. 80 knots to the square inch will serve for a floor rug. 120 will hold a small pattern if your eyes and back are willing. Cut pile only when the row has agreed to stay where you put it. Never cut in dim light unless you're prepared to forgive yourself. The 30 samples are not mine alone. They belong to the hands that carried them here. Some were Cherokee, some German, some Scots-Irish, some black, some named, some unnamed, because history is often careless with the poor. Do not make a museum of them unless you can keep them alive. A pattern shut behind glass is safer than a pattern forgotten. But cloth was made to enter rooms where people live. You may wonder why I hid money instead of leaving instructions with a lawyer. I have known lawyers who were honest, and I have known honest instructions eaten by fees, pride, quarrels, and men who believed property became theirs when women grew tired. The one who finds this beam will have done more than inherit. She or he will have listened to the hollow place and opened it with care. That is a better test than blood. Inheritance is not what falls into your hands, it is what you are willing to carry without making it smaller. Houses are not saved by affection alone. Neither are trades, names, tools, or the dead. Save only what you can tend. Tend only what you can love in a daily way. If you cannot stay, take the samples to someone who will know them. If you can stay, leave more than you found. There is a walnut tree behind the shop, split by lightning but living. In its lower trunk, where the old horseshoe has grown halfway into bark, I marked the place my mother said we should remember. You will know it by iron. I have not had strength to open it again. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You're welcome here. Hester May Whitlow, November 14th, 1978. Thea read the last line and did not move. The lamp made a small sound beside her, a soft draw of flame inside glass. Morning had come fully while she read, yet the room seemed held in a different hour. one made from hospital paper, walnut dye, war years, women's names, and the exact heat at which wool must not be wounded. Dust moved in the light above the counter. Outside, one bird crossed the cracked window so quickly it became only a shadow. She read the letter again. The second reading was slower. She stopped at the names: Hester, Eliza, Sarai, Marta, Jonah, Eli, Thomas, Samuel. She put one finger beneath each line about temperature, ratios, timing, tension, and knots. Not because she could remember all of it, but because the body sometimes begins storing knowledge before the mind can arrange it. When she finished, she folded the pages along their original creases, not new folds, not hers. She placed the letter back inside its envelope and set it on the counter beside the medal. Then she took the 30 small sample rugs from the blanket and laid them in a row across the front room floor, far enough from the stove that no stray spark could reach them. One by one, the patterns took the morning: stepped water, hooked blessing, broken chain, meeting house star, widow's window, river bend, laurel step. The room had not grown larger. It had become occupied. After a while, Thea put on her coat and went out the back door. The cold struck clean after the closeness of the letter. The yard behind the shop sloped toward the creek, but the walnut tree stood higher, just beyond the rotted woodpile, its trunk broad and black-seamed from weather. The lightning split Mrs. Crowell had mentioned in directions was there, running down one side in a long-heeled scar, where bark had folded over itself year after year. The lower limbs reached outward, bare against the pale sky. Thea walked around it once. At first she saw only bark, moss, old hulls pressed into mud, and the usual scars of age. Then she knelt on the side facing the shop. Near the base, partly swallowed by the trunk, was iron. A horseshoe, not nailed on. Grown in, the tree had taken it slowly, year by year, closing bark around the curve until only half the shoe remained visible, dark as river stone, the nail holes filled with lichen. Thea touched the iron with 2 fingers. It was colder than the bark. You will know it by iron. She looked for an opening, a mark, hollow. There was none she could see. The bark around the horseshoe had sealed tight. Whatever Hester's mother had meant to remember, the tree had kept it with a patience no human lock could equal. Thea did not force it. She cleared leaves from the roots instead, with her bare hands at first, then with a stick under the wet leaf mould. She found 2 broken pieces of pottery, a rusted nail, a walnut shell split clean by some animal's tooth. Nothing else. The ground smelled dark and alive. When her knees began to ache from the cold, she stood and rested her palm on the trunk. The shop looked different from there. Smaller, more fragile, less abandoned. The sign above the front door was hidden from this angle, but she knew the letters were there, faint in the wood, a name that had been waiting not for recognition, but for work. Inside again, she opened the cupboard where she had found the candles. The bundle was tied with string so brittle it broke when she loosened it. Most of the candles had warped into pale curves. One had a date scratched near the base with a pin or knife point, 1918. Another, shorter and thicker, was wrapped in tissue marked Christmas beeswax, EW 1964. It had yellowed with age but held its shape, and when Thea brought it near her face, it smelled faintly of honey, smoke, and closed drawers. She chose that one. Not because it was the oldest, because it had been given. She placed it in a brass holder found on the shelf behind the ledger, cleaned the socket with a rag, and set it on the counter beside the letter. The matchbox still held only 2 whole matches after the chimney fire, and she used one carefully, striking it downward along the worn strip. Flame caught, bent and steadied. She held it to the beeswax wick until the candle took. The light was modest. It did not transform the room. It did not make hardship beautiful or hunger noble. It burned with a small exact flame and gave off the scent of warm honey. That was enough. Thea stood before it with both hands resting on the counter. the way a person might stand before a grave or a table set for someone not yet home. The chain of small kindnesses came to her not as a lesson, but as names attached to gestures. The silver-haired woman at the mission desk who found $2 and a paper sack, then pretended it was ordinary. Mrs. Crowell, who put her own bill into a county drawer so the transfer could rest on proper paper. All-in Pike, who opened a credit account with a black-and-white notebook and no soft words to make himself feel generous. Doris Bell, who lied cleanly about making too many biscuits and let the lie preserve both their dignity. None of them had saved her. That mattered. They had not lifted her out of the road, or solved the roof, or made the well safe, or repaired the years behind her. They had placed small things within reach: a meal, a signature, a tool, a number, a warning, a way not to turn back. Thea understood then that rescue was not always a door flung open. Sometimes it was a person leaving one match where another hand could find it. If you're hearing this tonight from your own chair, your own kitchen, your own dark room after a long day, you may remember such a kindness. Not the grand kind that gets named in public, but the one almost too small to explain. A ride offered in rain, a bill quietly paid, a neighbor who mowed the strip near your fence when grief had made grass impossible, a nurse who warmed the blanket before bringing it to your bed, a teacher who kept your paper instead of laughing at the handwriting, a stranger who saw you counting coins and looked away at the right moment. If you can leave that memory in the comments, not to make a monument of it, just to name the person or the place or the small mercy, so it does not disappear. The candle burned lower. Thea returned the samples to their stack, placing clean paper between each one from the back of unused county forms. She wrapped the heirloom tools again, but kept the bone shuttle out, laying it beside the letter as a marker. The money she counted no further. The notebook held the number. The number would wait. By late afternoon she carried the tin box to the back room and placed it beneath the work table, not inside the beam again, but under the eye of the loom. Then she cooked cornmeal over the stove, slowly, stirring until the bottom stopped threatening to catch. She ate sitting on the floor near the candle. After supper, she went once more to the doorway of the back room. The opened warp beam showed its hollow end where the cedar disc had been removed. The brass cap lay nearby. Inside that darkness there was no more package, no more secret that she knew of. Only the space left by what had been kept. She thought of Hester in a hospital room, writing while her body made its last narrow bargain with time. She thought of Ruthie's shed already emptied before she arrived. She thought of Rowan laying screws on a saucer so nothing would be lost. Then she banked the stove, checked the door, and made her bed in the front room as before. But this time she placed the letter, the medal, the bone shuttle, the small shears, and one folded sample rug inside the tin and set it beside her hip under the edge of the blanket. Not hidden. Kept close. The beeswax candle burned in the brass holder until the flame bent low and drowned itself in a small pool of gold. The room darkened. Thea lay on her side with the heirlooms beside her, listening to the creak below the hill and to the loom in the back room, where the warp threads shifted now and then in the cold breath of the broken window, patient as rain that had not yet decided to fall. The first snow came on December 3rd, and by noon it had laid 4 inches across the clearing. It softened the failed places without hiding them. The west eave still sagged under its white margin. The chimney still leaned enough for the eye to return to it. The missing porch board remained a dark gap beneath the snow, and the lane through the walnut trees held 2 faint lines where Thea had walked to town the day before and returned with lamp oil, cornmeal, and a letter from the county tax office that she had opened standing beside the stove. She did not begin on the roof because she was brave. She began because water had begun to find the shop in 3 places. One drip fell near the back room wall, steady and exact, striking a tin basin with a sound like a patient clock. Another appeared above the front counter, darkening the ceiling boards in a patch shaped like a hand. The third was worse, a slow bead forming along the west wall where the roofline had dropped, then running down behind the shelves where paper patterns were stored. That one made the decision. Thea moved the patterns first. She wrapped them in clean cloth and stored them in the driest cupboard. Then she laid pans, jars, and the enamel basin beneath the leaks and took Orland's repair book to the counter. Chapter 7 covered roofs in plain houses, though its photographs showed farmhouses with neat ladders, square chimneys, and men wearing canvas coats who appeared to have help. She read the chapter 3 times. The first reading gave her fear proper names: rafter tail, sheathing, felt, flashing, ridgeline, drip edge, valley, pitch. The second reading told her what could be postponed and what could not. The third reading, done aloud by lamplight while the snow tapped the window glass, taught her the order of work. Do not tear off more than you can cover before weather. Do not stand on rotten sheathing. Do not trust old nails. Do not roof in a wind that wants argument. By morning, she had measured from inside and outside. The main roof was roughly 22 feet wide by 38 feet long, with a pitch steep enough to shed water, but not steep enough to excuse neglect. The west slope had the worst damage, a run about 12 feet long where cedar shakes had curled upward like dried leaves, and the tin patch had lifted along one seam. She calculated materials in Orland's notebook with a dull pencil: 2 bundles of asphalt shingles to patch the west face and rear edge, 1 partial roll of 30-pound roofing felt from Orland's damaged stock, 4 pounds of galvanized roofing nails, 1 strip of drip edge if he had any bent or left over, 2 pieces of 1x6 for sheathing repair, and lumber for at least 1 sister rafter. The number on the page looked less like math than winter itself. She walked to town after the road thawed enough to hold footsteps. Orland read her list at the counter, his scarred eyebrow rising slightly over the word sister. You know what that means. A sound rafter fastened beside a weak one to carry load. Book told you that? Yes. Book tell you rafters do not always accept company? Yes. He grunted, which seemed to cover several opinions. Behind him, on a high shelf above the stovepipe elbows, hung a small roofing hatchet with a square pole, a notched blade, and a leather-wrapped handle darkened nearly black. Orland took it down without looking at the price tag, because there was none. My uncle used this, he said. Roofed barns from here to Burnsville after the war. He died owing nobody and speaking less than was convenient. He set the hatchet on the counter. I cannot take that. You are not taking it. You're borrowing it until I ask for it back. When will that be? When I see whether you treat it right. The tool had a balance unlike a hammer. It wanted a confident wrist, and punished the unsure one by twisting slightly in the hand. Thea wrapped it in burlap with the nails and felt, then helped Orland load the shingles into the back of a blue pickup driven by a man she had not met. The man was named Amos Tiller. He had once roofed houses before his knees made ladders, an argument he preferred not to win. He was 73, narrow as a fence post, with a grey beard trimmed close to his chin and eyes so pale they looked washed by weather. He wore a black knit cap, brown overalls, and a coat patched at one elbow with denim. When Orland introduced him, Amos did not offer a hand. He only looked at Thea's boots. You climb? Yes. You freeze? Some? You listen? Yes. Then I will come look. He followed her back to the shop with the materials, the pickup moving slowly over the gravel lane, tires hissing through thawed snow. At the clearing he stood for some time looking at the roof from the ground. He walked the perimeter once. He sighted the west eave. He bent, picked up a fallen shake, broke it in both hands, and smelled the split edge. Too much rot for pride, he said. I cannot pay you. I did not hear myself ask. I will pay when I can. No. Thea waited. Amos pointed toward the west slope. You will pay by not falling. That is enough for me. He would not climb the ladder beyond the first few rungs, but he knew roof lines the way Ruthie had known knots. He taught from the ground in terse sentences, most shorter than commands. Set your ladder wider. Weight over feet. 3 points. Do not reach. Move the ladder. Again. The work took 11 days because weather interrupted, because she moved slowly, because the roof insisted on showing another weak place whenever one had been corrected. On the first day, she cleared snow with a push broom tied to a long pole. On the second, Amos showed her how to lift damaged shakes without tearing sound ones around them. On the third, she found the rafter tail that had caused the sag. It had rotted where water entered behind the lifted tin. Thea lay on the roof with her weight spread low, cold pressing through her coat, and looked down through the opened patch into the dim back room below. The damaged rafter was dark at the end, fibrous under the all-point, not gone entirely, not trustworthy. Amos had her cut a sister rafter from new lumber, matching the angle against the soundspan beside it. He marked the cut with chalk, then made her mark it again. "Line first," he said. "I did. Better line." She drew it slower. "Now cut." The handsaw bound twice before she learned to let the tool work instead of forcing it. The new board smelled sharp and bright against the damp odor of aged cedar. With Amos watching from below, she fit it beside the weakened rafter and fastened it with staggered nails, not all in one line, because a straight line of nails could become a place for wood to split under load. When she drove the first nail, it stopped high. "That nail's proud. I see it. Pull it." She pulled it. The second bent. "Pull it." She pulled that one too. By the fifth, her rhythm improved. Amos taught her the 3-stroke nail first tap to set, second to drive true, third to seat without bruising the shingle. She wanted to use 4, sometimes 5. He stopped her with one word: "Done." On the 6th day, they snapped a chalk line across the patch course. The blue dust jumped from the cord and struck the felt in a clean rule that seemed almost luxurious after so many uneven things. She laid roofing felt over repaired sheathing, overlapping as the book instructed, fastening only enough to hold against weather. Then shingles, staggered, trimmed, nailed. No exposed fastener where water could claim it, no edge left proud for wind. Her knees bruised, her palms blistered inside the gloves. The cold entered through sleeves and collar and found every place where she had believed herself covered. At dusk she came down the ladder stiffly, shoulders trembling from effort held too long. Amos would be sitting on an overturned bucket near the walnut tree, chewing nothing, watching the roof, as if it were a mule that might yet behave. "Again tomorrow," he would say. "Yes?" On the 9th day the west eave straightened enough that snowmelt ran past the wall instead of into it. On the 10th she sealed the lifted tin patch over the rear slope and replaced 3 split shakes near the chimney. On the 11th December 15th, they stood in the clearing after a thin morning rain and watched water move down the roof in proper lines. It fell from the edge in a clear run, not behind the wall. Amos removed his cap, scratched his head, and put the cap back on. "That will hold," he said. "For how long?" He looked at the sky, then at the patched slope. "Longer if you keep looking at it." Thea understood that as blessing. That evening she hung the roofing hatchet on a peg near the front door, not with the old weaving tools but apart, where work that had saved the roof could rest in plain sight. The leak pans stayed dry through the night. For the first time since the snow began, the silence inside the shop did not include dripping. January hardened the ground. By the second week mornings came in the low 20s, and the inside of the cracked window silvered at the edges before dawn. Thea woke with her breath visible above the blankets and her hands tucked beneath her arms, listening for the stove. If the fire had lived through the night, the room held a pocket of mercy. If it had gone out, the cold seemed to have entered every object and taken ownership. The chimney had survived the first careful fires, but survival was not soundness. The problem showed itself after a thaw and freeze. Small flakes appeared on the hearth, pale and gritty, like coarse meal. Then came a reddish powder beneath the rear wall where the chimney passed upward. Outside the crown showed spalling bricks, faces broken away by water entering and freezing inside the clay. Mortar had turned soft in places, powdering under a thumbnail. One joint near the shoulder had opened wide enough for moss to take root. The repair book warned that chimneys fail slowly. Then, all at once, Orlin confirmed it. He stood outside with Thea one morning, looking up at the stack while steam from his coffee rose between them. He had brought supplies in the store truck, because he said only a fool carried mortar mix 6 miles by hand, and Thea had not argued. Portland cement is too hard for this old work, he said. You use the wrong mortar, the brick suffers for the joint's pride. He gave her a sack of hydrated hydraulic lime, a smaller bag of fire clay, washed sand, a stiff brush, a pointing trowel, a margin trowel, a jointer, and a bucket whose handle had been replaced with wire. From under the seat of the truck, she pulled out a jar of powdered soot and ash. For colour? Thea asked. For humility, he said. New mortar shouting white from old brick is a sin against the eye. The mix for the outer joints was 3 parts sand to 1 part hydraulic lime dampened slowly until it held shape when squeezed but did not weep water. For firebox and throat repairs, where heat would matter, Orlan had her use 1 part fire clay, 1 part sand, and 1 part lime, mixed in small batches because cold weather shortened patience and poor mixing left weak places hidden until flame found them. Do not smear over bad work, he said. Rake out loose mortar first. 1/2 inch deep if it gives. More if it lies to you. Thea worked in intervals because the cold would not allow anything else. Every 15 minutes, her bare fingers went numb. Gloves protected skin but ruined touch, and chimney work required touch. She had to feel which mortar was loose, which brick face had softened, which joint had enough depth to accept new material. She wore gloves to carry tools and remove debris, then stripped them off to press mortar in with the trowel point, packing from back to front so no hollow remained behind the joint. After each interval, she warmed her hands around a jar of hot water wrapped in cloth. The pain of feeling returning was worse than numbness. She learned not to make a sound when it came. Sound spent strength without repairing brick. For 3 weeks, the chimney became the day's measure. Smorning rake joints on the sheltered side while frost still held the mud. Midday mix mortar in batches small enough to use before it stiffened. Afternoon point strike brush cover with damp burlap if the night threatened too hard a freeze. Evening climb down, bank the little stove fire low, wash lime from her wrists and nails, and check the repaired joints by lamplight through the open stove door. She did not rush the curing. That may have been the first real discipline of the rebuild. A roof asked for urgency because rain was plain. Mortar asked for restraint. Too fast and it cracked. Too wet. And it sagged. Too dry and it failed to bond. Too proud a joint and water would sit where it should shed. Each mistake could harden into permanence if she admired her own effort more than the wall's need. Amos came twice, though chimneys were not his trade. The first time he watched her strike a joint too smooth. Wrong, she looked down from the ladder. Too much. Too pretty. She cut it back and brushed the surface until it matched the weathered brick around it. The second time, she brought a thermos of coffee and a folded rag. He said nothing about either. He placed them on the stump near the woodpile and looked up at the crown. Better. From Amos. That was nearly a sermon. The worst work came near the top, where Spaulding had eaten half the face from 3 bricks. Orlan advised replacing only what had lost integrity, not every brick that looked homely. Thea found salvaged brick behind the shop beneath leaves, old and close enough in colour. She soaked each one lightly before setting it so it would not steal water too fast from the mortar. Then she bedded them, tapped them true with the wooden handle of the trowel, checked the line, and scraped excess mortar back into the bucket. On January 28th, under a sky the colour of pewter, she made the test fire. She began with paper, then cedar slivers, then 2 wrist-thick pieces of dry oak from the old pile's heartwood, split clean after she chopped away rot. The stove door remained open. The front door stood cracked. The chimney drew slowly at first, as cold masonry resisted the warm column of smoke. Then the draught strengthened. Outside, smoke rose from the chimney in a clean grey line. No billow from joints. No cough from the rear wall. No bitter roll back into the room. Thea stood in the clearing with her coat pulled close and watched until the smoke thinned, almost invisible against the winter sky. Orlin had told her once that a good chimney did not call attention to itself. It simply carried danger upward. That evening, the fire burned hotter than any fire she had allowed before. Still modest, still watched, but steady. Heat entered the bricks around the stove and remained after the flames lowered. The front room warmed enough for Thea to remove her gloves. She ate cornmeal with beans from a jar Doris had left in a paper sack on the porch 2 days earlier. The spoon did not shake in her hand. Before sleeping, she went outside once more. The chimney stood dark against the stars, scarred, patched, imperfect, and working. A narrow thread of smoke rose into the cold, and the shop below it seemed for the first time not merely spared, but inhabited. The floors had waited under every other urgency. They had endured snowmelt carried in on boots, soot from chimney work, lime dust, dragged lumber, spilled ash, and the daily traffic of one life trying not to fall through itself. By late January, Thea could no longer ignore the way dust rose between planks when she crossed the front room, or how the boards near the stove flexed with a tired complaint that felt too much like warning. The floor was white pine, mostly original, laid in planks of uneven width. Some were 12 inches across, some 9, some narrow as a hand. The saw marks varied, and so did the nails. Near the counter, older boards were fixed with hand-cut rosehead nails, their square shoulders still visible when light struck low. Later repairs used wire nails brighter once, now rusted into dark circles. The difference gave the floor a record of injury and care, one generation crossing over another without erasing it. She did not want to replace more than necessary. Orlin approved that. New floors are for people selling houses, he said. Sound old boards are for people living in them. He sold her 2 salvaged pine planks from a dismantled church classroom, close in age but not pretending to be the same. He also rented her a random orbit sander for $14 a day, after making her sign a line in the account book, and promised not to let the cord cross her work path. Sanders eat carelessness, he said. Thea carried it home in Amos's truck, with Amos driving and pretending he had business down her road. Before sanding, there was repair. She lifted the worst boards near the stove using a flat bar and patience, working around the rosehead nails where she could save them. Some nails came out whole, some snapped. Some refused until she cut around them and left their blackened bodies buried in the joist, a compromise that felt disrespectful until Orlin told her old houses were made of such truces. Under one board, she found a marble, blue glass with a white swirl. Under another, 3 acorn caps and a mouse nest built from wall clippings. Under the softest plank, she found the source of the trouble, a joist end weakened by damp where the chimney leak had fed it year after year. Not failed through. Not yet. She sistered a short joist section alongside it, using screws from Orlin's bent box bin and construction adhesive whose smell filled the room with sharp chemical insistence. Then she laid the salvaged planks, trimming them to fit the irregular gap. The new pieces stood pale at first. Too pale. She left them alone. "Time will fix that if you do not hurry it," Amos said. Then came sanding. The first pass was 80 grit. The sander growled against the pine, not as violent as a belt sander, but firm enough that Thea had to use both hands and keep her shoulders loose. She worked with the grain, overlapping passes, moving slowly enough to cut, but not so slowly that the machine dug shallow moons into the boards. Dust rose despite the bag. It coated her sleeves, her lashes, the counter, the stove, the jars, even the air beyond the doorway to the loom room. Pine dust had a sweetness beneath age, a smell like summer hidden under winter's floor. The old finish came off unevenly. Near the door, grey lifted to honey. Near the stove, black stains remained in the grain no matter how long she worked them, and she chose not to chase them too deep. A house that had kept fire for more than a century had earned some darkness. Around rosehead nails, she sanded by hand, folding paper around a scrap block and working in small circles until her fingertips cramped. The second pass was 120 grit. The room changed under that finer abrasion. Harsh marks softened, old edges lowered. The boards began to receive light instead of merely resisting it. She vacuumed with an old shop vac-all-in loaned from the store, then wiped with cloth dampened only slightly because pine will raise its grain if soaked like laundry. The third pass was 220. That one felt almost ceremonial. The sander's sound became familiar enough to enter the body as weather, back and forth, lift before stopping, cord behind, dust bag emptied often, window cracked, mask tied tight. Thea worked from the far wall toward the door so she would not trap herself on finished wood. By the end, her arms trembled. The rental had to go back after one day or the account would gather another $14. Amos returned at dusk, and together they loaded the sander into the truck bed. He looked through the open door at the pale floor. "You found it," he said. Found what? What was under all that grey? After sanding came oil. Orlin had argued with himself for 10 minutes before choosing. Polyurethane would seal harder, he said, and demand less from her later, but it would also lay a skin over the wood, bright and separate. And old pine under plastic made him distrust breakfast. He sold her tung oil cut with mineral spirits for the first coat, and a small can of boiled linseed oil to blend into later coats, with warnings about rags that could heat and burn if left folded. Lay them flat outside, he said, or drown them in water. Fire starts quiet. The first coat darkened the pine to warm honey almost as soon as the cloth touched it. Thea worked kneeling, rubbing oil into the grain, then wiping back what the wood refused. No puddles, no shine for pride's sake. The thirsty boards drank unevenly, old knots deepened. The black stains near the stove became less like damage and more like memory. 48 hours to cure. She obeyed. The second coat brought amber. The third, laid after another 2 days, pulled the oldest boards toward mahogany at their edges, especially where feet had worn them smooth across decades. The salvaged planks remained lighter but no longer shouted. They had entered the room's language and would learn the accent later. There was one bad morning. It came between the second and third coat after rain had kept her awake and the wind had driven smoke down the chimney for half an hour before the draft corrected. She woke with her throat raw, her wrists sore, her stomach empty in a way that felt older than breakfast. The floor waited for buffing. The stove wanted ash removed. The window putty had cracked further in the cold. The tax notice lay under a jar on the counter. Everything needed hands. Thea sat up and could not stand. Not from illness. From being emptied. She stayed that way until the fire sank to coals. Then she put on her coat, took no tools, and walked down past the creek to the marshy bend beyond the lower field where cattails stood stiff and brown in the winter light. A great blue heron lifted from the water as she approached, wide wings opening with unhurried authority, legs trailing, body rising from mud and cold, as if the air had been waiting to hold it. The bird crossed the marsh once and settled farther away. Thea sat on a flat stone and watched it. She did not work that day. No roof failed because of it. No chimney collapsed. No ancestor withdrew permission. The floor remained unfinished and did not condemn her. The marsh water moved in dull silver seams between reeds. The heron stood nearly motionless for so long that Thea began to understand stillness not as absence but as labour of another kind. Near evening, she returned to the shop, warmed beans, and slept early. The next morning, she buffed the second coat and laid the third. By the time February approached, the front room floor held light. Not much, because winter light was thin and the windows were poor, but enough that when Thea crossed from stove to counter, she could see her movement pass across the boards in a low reflection, blurred and brown gold, like someone walking through remembered water. February announced itself through glass, or through the lack of it. There were 8 windows in the shop. 3 had no glass at all, only boards, cloth and winter, finding its way around both. 4 were cracked, each in a different pattern. 1 long diagonal split, 1 spidered corner, 1 pane broken clean across the middle, and one so crazed with fine lines that frost made it look like lace. The last window, narrow and wavy, stood in the back room beside the loom. Its glass was original, according to Orlan, or close enough that replacing it would be an act of ignorance. "You do not throw away 1788 glass because it waves at you," he said. The shop was not built then. Glass travels. Houses do, too. In pieces. The pane had bubbles suspended inside it, tiny seeds of air caught from some furnace long gone cold. When Thea looked through it, the walnut tree outside bent slightly at the edges. The world beyond seemed to breathe. That window she left untouched except to clean. For the others, Orlan found salvaged panes in the loft above the hardware store, wrapped in newspaper and dust. None fit perfectly. That was expected. Old sash rarely obeyed exact measurement after years of weather. Thea measured each opening twice, wrote width and height in the notebook, then measured diagonally to learn how far each frame had drifted out of square. "Glass does not forgive pride," Orlan said while scoring the first pane on the store counter. "Press once. Hear the line. Do not saw at it." The cutter made a sound like ice beginning to crack. He snapped the glass clean over a wooden dowel, then had her do the next. Her first break wandered. Her second held. By the fourth, her hand had learned the pressure well enough to trust the score. She bought DAP 33 glazing putty on account, a small tub with a lid stiff from store dust, along with glazing points, a putty knife, and 2 lengths of 1/4-inch cotton sash cord. The cord was for the front windows where the counterweights still lived inside their pockets, though the old ropes had rotted to powder and dropped the weights years before. Window work was slower than it looked from outside. First she removed the sash, or tried to paint, had sealed some in place. She worked the edges with a thin blade, tapping lightly, cutting through old layers, refusing to pry hard enough to split what could still serve. When a sash came free, she carried it to the work table and laid it on folded burlap. Old putty had to be softened, scraped, and coaxed. Some fell out in dry chunks, some clung with the stubbornness of bone. The glazing points were tiny and treacherous. She pressed them into the muntins with the edge of the putty knife, holding the glass firm but not strained. Too tight, Orlan warned, and cold would crack the pane when wood moved. Too loose and wind would rattle it all night. The putty had to be kneaded first, worked in the palm until it warmed and softened, then rolled into a rope, pressed along the rabbet, set beneath the glass, trimmed and finished with a clean angled bevel that shed water away. Her first bevel looked like bread dough pressed by a child. She scraped it off. The second was better. The third still held a wavering line, but it would keep rain out. By the 5th pane the knife moved more steadily, drawn at a deliberate angle, the excess putty curling away in a pale ribbon. She learned to dip the knife lightly in linseed oil when it dragged. She learned not to fuss too long over one corner, or the putty would lift and demand beginning again. She learned that repair often required knowing when to leave a mark alone. The sash cords were another education. At the front left window she removed the narrow pocket cover and found the iron counterweight lying at the bottom, furred with dust. The old cord had snapped near the pulley. She fed the new 1/4-inch cotton cord over the pulley with a bent wire, tied it to the weight with a figure-8 knot, because Orlan said a plain knot could slip when it got tired, and lowered the weight back into its pocket with both hands. The figure-8 pleased her. It had the same honesty as a good rug knot, over, around, back through, dressed clean, stightened evenly, not decorative, reliable. She tied each one with care, and trimmed the tail only after testing the sash twice. The first repaired window rose and held. Thea stood in front of it for a full minute, one hand still on the rail. It was a modest miracle, a pane lifting on hidden weight, staying where it was asked to stay, lowering when guided. She had lived for weeks inside doors that locked against her, systems that moved without her consent, papers that carried force because someone else stamped them. A window obeying the work of her hands felt like a reply too exact for words. By mid-February, the 3 empty openings held glass again. The room changed immediately. Wind no longer crossed it as if invited. The lamp flame steadied, dust settled downward instead of travelling sideways. Morning light entered in broader sheets, falling across the oiled floor and reaching the counter, the stove, the ledger, the brass candle holder, the stack of sample rugs wrapped in cloth. The cracked panes took longer because cracked glass can remain useful until touched. Thea replaced only what needed replacement. One diagonal split stayed in a high pane where water did not enter, and the crack had stopped at the muntin. She sealed the edge and left it. Not every scar required removal. On the last window, the one beside the loom but not the old 1788 pane, she worked during a grey afternoon while fine sleet ticked against the roof. The broken glass came out in two pieces, one shaped like a map without names. She cleaned the rabbet, laid fresh putty, set the salvaged pane, pressed the glazing points, and drew the bevel in one slow pass along the bottom edge. Outside, a chickadee landed on the walnut branch nearest the window. It held there, light as punctuation, black cap sharp against the pewter sky. Thea stopped with the putty knife in her hand. The bird turned its head once, quick and exact, then pecked at something hidden in the bark. For a few breaths, neither moved in any meaningful way. The loom stood behind her. The window held before her. The chickadee lifted, crossed the clearing, and vanished into laurel. Thea finished the last corner. She wiped the knife clean, smoothed the putty once with her thumb, and stepped back. 8 windows, some repaired, some replaced, one preserved, all of them now part of the shop's slow return to weather without surrendering to it. That night, the cold stayed outside more than it entered. Not entirely. Old walls are not arrogant enough for that, but the room held a steadier warmth and the firelight no longer shook in every draught. Thea sat on the floor near the stove with Hester's letter open beside her, reading again the instructions about tension, water temperature, wool, and patience. Beyond the front room, in the back, the loom waited under cleaner air and better glass. She had not yet tied one new knot. There was still too much to mend before beginning. 2 winters later, in December of 2024, the first finished rug came off the loom in a snow that fell without wind. It was not large, 30 inches by 46, narrow enough to carry under one arm, long enough to lie before a hearth or beside a bed where bare feet could find it in the morning. Thea had begun it in September after 2 years of practice squares, failed borders, uneven pile, over-tight rows, and 1 whole month spent doing nothing but tying and cutting plain wool knots on a scrap warp until her fingers stopped arguing with the lesson. The rug held 3 colours only: walnut brown, undied cream, a blue deep enough to make a person think of winter dusk on water. She had chosen a river pattern from one of the sample rugs, not the most elaborate, not the one visitors praised when she unwrapped the collection carefully on the counter, but a narrow pattern marked River Bend, adapted from Basket Echo, maker unknown. The note tied to the original sample said only that the design had travelled through 3 families and been altered each time it crossed a kitchen table. That seemed right. Thea cut the last row in morning light. She did not hurry the finishing. She tied off the warp, bound the edges, trimmed the pile again and again, until the surface lay even beneath her palm. Not perfect. She could see 3 places where tension had changed slightly because of weather, one corner where the blue dipped a hair lower than it should have, and a single knot near the centre that sat stubbornly proud after every careful clipping. She left that knot. There had to be one place where the rug admitted it had been made by human hands in winter. When the finished piece lay across the work table, the shop held a silence unlike the silence of abandonment. This silence had heat in it. It had swept floors, sealed windows, patched roof lines, and the faint tick of the stove cooling after breakfast. It had tools returned to hooks, wool sorted by shade, a kettle steaming on the back of the stove, and a ledger opened not to debt but to orders written in pencil. The front room had changed slowly enough that no single morning could claim the transformation. The counter had been sanded only by hand, leaving its deep scars intact. The glass jars behind it held buttons again, but also bobbins, business cards, folded tags, and small skeins of naturally dyed wool tied with cotton thread. The ledger from 1981 rested beneath a clean cloth on the upper shelf, too fragile for daily use, but not hidden. Beside it sat Orland's black and white account notebook, now closed, paid through the last line, and kept because it had told the first honest version of the rebuilding. The stovepipe was straight. The chimney drew clean. The pine floor, dark honey near the door and almost mahogany by the hearth, held the long reflection of afternoon light. The windows did not match one another, and Thea had learned to love that. One pane bent the walnut tree, one showed the lane clearly. One kept a diagonal scar in the upper corner where she had refused to replace glass that still served. The original wavy pane beside the loom remained the shop's gentlest distortion, making snowflakes seem to drift from a century away. There were no bright signs, no grand reopening. Only an index card pinned to the corkboard at Doris's morning table. Whitlow Rug Works. Hand-knotted rugs. Repairs by appointment. Small orders only. Leave name with Doris. Doris had written the card because she said Thea's handwriting was too careful and might frighten people into thinking they could not afford anything. She had added, beneath the words, a tiny pencil drawing of a rug with crooked fringe. Thea had not corrected it. By the second winter, the mailing list held 43 names. Not customers in the modern sense. Names, addresses, requests, people who wanted a stair runner repaired because their grandmother had worn a path down the center, a woman from Mars Hill who wanted 2 chair pads made from wool grown on her own sheep, a church secretary asking whether an altar kneeler could be mended without losing the old stitches, Mrs. Crowell wanting nothing but leaving her name because she said a list should begin with a witness. Thea worked slowly. She charged plainly. She refused work she could not do well. Most days the money stayed where it had been placed after the counting and the letter, sealed in new archival envelopes inside the tin, then stored in a locked drawer beneath the work table. Not because she did not need it. Need did not vanish after one discovery. Need simply became less wild. She used 3 coins in the first year. 1 silver dime placed in the county tax envelope because she wanted the first payment to carry Hester's keeping forward. 1 wheat penny set into a crack near the hearth before the final floor oil cured. Not for luck exactly, but remembrance. And 1 worn buffalo nickel given to Caleb Tiller, after he spent 4 Saturdays splitting kindling and would accept nothing that could be called wages. He had held it on his palm and frowned. "This is too old," he said. "So is the work." He had closed his hand around it then. The rest remained untouched, except for counting once each December, not to admire the sum but to make sure damp, mice, and carelessness had not found it. Thea added to it when she could, $5 from a repair, 2 from a set of wool coasters, a folded 10 after the first rug deposit. Each new bill went into an envelope marked the next one, because that was how Hester had written of inheritance, not as possession, but as provision. The medal did not remain in the tin. On May 27, 2024, Memorial Day, Thea carried it to the Western Carolina State Veterans Cemetery in Black Mountain. Mrs. Crowell drove because she said mountain roads were not improved by solemn errands, and Orland came because he had known men who returned from war, and men who returned only as stories. Amos sat in the front seat beside Mrs. Crowell, wearing a dark coat too formal for his shoulders. They found no grave for the name on Hester's card. That had been expected. The paper had said buried at sea. So they stood near the memorial walkway while the morning warmed around them and flags moved in a slow line along the graves. Thea held the World War II Victory Medal in both hands, wrapped in blue wool except for the bronze face. She did not make a speech. She read the name from the card. Thomas Whitlow, U.S. Navy, 1945. Then she folded the cloth back over the medal and held it still for 1 full minute while traffic moved beyond the cemetery road and birds called from the trees. Orland removed his cap. Amos did the same. Mrs. Crowell kept her eyes on the flags. Afterward, Thea returned the medal to the shop and placed it in a shallow frame with its card, mounted beneath glass beside the sample rug's cabinet. not displayed as treasure, kept as record. The label beneath it was written in pencil. Returned to memory, the brass key did not reveal itself until the first hard freeze of the second winter. It had sat on the mantel for months before that, found in an oak box wedged beneath a loosened stairboard when Thea had finally repaired the back steps. The key was small, darker than gold, with a bow shaped like a hooked diamond from the old patterns. Inside the same box had been a tintype photograph dated summer of 1903, a young woman standing before the shop, her hair pinned severely, one hand resting on a loom beater, her face so close to Thea's that Mrs. Crowell had crossed herself before pretending she had only brushed lint from her coat. On the back, in faded ink, was written, Eliza Ann Callahan Whitlow, daughter of Sarai, age 25, summer of 1903. Thea had kept the photograph in the same frame as Hester's letter copy, and left the key on the mantel because no lock in the shop accepted it. Then, after a night of freezing rain, a strip of bark split away from the lightning-scarred walnut tree. The sound came just after dawn, a sharp crack like a rifle far off. Thea stepped onto the porch with her shawl around her shoulders and saw the tree standing as it had stood, except near the old horseshoe where a fresh seam had opened along the healed wound. Ice glazed the bark. The visible half of the horseshoe shone black and silver under it. She went down after breakfast with gloves, a lantern, and the key in her pocket, though she did not yet know why she had taken it. The bark near the horseshoe had lifted enough to show a narrow brass plate beneath, set deep into the living wood long ago and nearly swallowed. It was no larger than her palm, green with age, edged by bark that had grown around it like flesh around a splinter. At its centre was a keyhole so small she might have missed it if morning light had not caught the rim. Thea stood very still. Then she took the key from her pocket. It entered with resistance, then seated fully. She turned it slowly, afraid of breaking what could not be replaced. Something inside the tree gave a dry click. The brass plate loosened. Behind it was a hollow no larger than a bread box, lined with cedar gone dark and fragrant when air touched it. Inside lay a folded flag with 48 stars wrapped in oilcloth and a note sealed in a glass jar with a waxed cork. The flag was not large, perhaps the size used for a casket or memorial table, its cotton yellowed at the folds but whole. Thea carried both inside before opening the jar. The note was dated June 15th, 1918. To the child who remembers after us. This flag was sent home after Eli went to France, not because he died there, but because his mother believed every family should keep one folded against the day a name came back changed. He returned with breath enough to live and not enough to farm. That is also a kind of casualty. If war takes a body, the town rings bells. If war returns the body with its sleep ruined, its lungs burning, its temper frightened of doors, the house must learn a quieter mourning. Keep this flag not for glory, keep it for witness. Sarai Bird Callahan. Written by Eliza, because mother's hand pains her. Thea read the note beside the stove while sleet tapped the repaired windows. The words settled differently from Hester's letter. They were shorter, plainer, nearer the bone. She folded the note again and placed it with the flag in an archival box ordered through the library, paid for with new money from her own work, not the hidden cash. The brass key returned to the mantel afterward, but no longer as a question. It lay beside the bone shuttle and the blue glass marble found under the floor, 3 small objects that had each waited in a different kind of dark. The walnut tree was not opened further. The hollow was closed again with the brass plate, and Thea sealed the edges with beeswax warmed in her hand. She did not try to remove the horseshoe. The tree had earned its keeping. That same December, after the first rug was finished but before it was delivered, Caleb arrived carrying something wrapped in a quilt. He was taller than when Thea had first met him, with wrists emerging too far from his coat sleeves, and a seriousness that sat on him unevenly, like a borrowed hat. His Schwinn bicycle leaned against the porch rail, though he was nearly too big for it now. Snow clung to the tires. He stamped his boots twice before entering because Doris had trained half the county to respect Thea's flaws. "I made you something," he said. Thea set down the shears. He unwrapped the quilt on the counter. Inside was a wooden sign, hand-carved from walnut, the letters deep and a little uneven, but cleanly cut. He had followed the shape of the old sign above the door, though not the words exactly. Whitlow Rug Works and Daughters, plural. Thea touched the final S. For a moment, the shop seemed to arrange itself around that letter. Hester, Eliza, Sarai, Marta, Ruthie, women named and unnamed, women who had crossed patterns from one people into another and tried with imperfect human hands not to steal what they could instead carry with acknowledgement, women who had hidden money, taught knots, sharpened blades, warmed bricks, signed notes, mended what men called obsolete, and left evidence small enough to survive pride. Caleb shifted his weight. "My mother said it needed that." "What did she say?" "Exactly." He looked at the floor. "She said men keep naming things after themselves and then wondering why women stop coming in." Thea laughed once. It surprised both of them. The sound was small, but it remained in the rafters longer than expected. Caleb looked relieved. He had been afraid, she realized, that the sign might trespass. Instead, it had opened a window without breaking glass. "I cannot pay you enough for this," she said. "You already gave me that nickel. That was not enough. It was to me." He helped her hang it inside first, above the counter, because winter was no time to climb for the outdoor sign. They used 2 brass screws from Orland's better drawer, which Caleb had paid for himself and refused to discuss. The sign settled against the wall as if it had been intended there all along. In spring, they would hang another outside. For now, the old weathered sign remained above the door, the faded name still visible to anyone willing to look closely, while the new one waited indoors, protected from sleet, smelling faintly of fresh walnut and teenage effort. The shop reopened quietly after that. Not with hours painted on glass, because Thea still worked by weather, light, and the demands of drying wool. Not with a cash register, because the tin cash box served after being cleaned and lined with felt. Not with a website, because Mrs. Crowell said any person who truly needed a hand-knotted rug repair could manage a telephone call or a note left with Doris. People came slowly. A widow from Weaverville brought a rug her husband had bought in 1972 and asked only whether the torn border could be kept from worsening. A young couple came from Asheville wanting something authentic, then grew quiet when Thea explained that authenticity was not a color palette but a chain of responsibility. They ordered nothing that day, but the woman returned 3 months later with wool from her grandmother's cedar chest and asked whether chair pads might be made for a kitchen table. One Saturday, Mrs. Crowell brought the blue runner Ruthie had made for her in 1986. The white hooks still held their corners. The center had worn thin where decades of feet had crossed between kitchen and hallway. Thea laid it on the work table and ran her hand above, not over, the damaged place. She could almost hear Ruthie's voice, not as ghost or miracle, only as memory made useful. "Do not tug like you're angry. The wool remembers." She repaired that runner for no charge. Mrs. Crowell objected. Thea pointed to the framed copy of the first deed transfer receipt, where one worn dollar had been noted in county record. "Already paid," she said. Mrs. Crowell looked at her over the tops of her glasses, then put the receipt back in her purse without another word. The dollar itself remained in the clerk's desk drawer. Not an official record anymore that had been posted long since, but Mrs. Crowell had taped a small envelope beneath the shallow tray where she kept paper clips, courthouse keys, and cough drops. Inside lay the same worn bill she had taken from her purse on the morning of the transfer. A crease still ran down its center. The tiny ink mark near Washington's shoulder remained. She told no one at first. Then one afternoon, when Thea came in to pay the final portion of the back taxes, Mrs. Crowell opened the drawer and showed it to her. "I kept it," she said. Thea looked at the bill through the envelope. "Why?" The clerk pressed the drawer shut gently. "Some records belong where paper cannot file them." Thea nodded. There was no need to ask for it. The bill had done its work. It had crossed from one hand to another at the right hour, and become part of a story larger than its value. Let the county keep its copies. Let Mrs. Crowell keep the dollar. Let some forms of witness remain under a tray near paper clips, waiting without demand. That winter, on the longest night of the year, Thea began her own letter. She did not know who would read it. That was the first humility of the task. A letter written only to someone imagined too clearly becomes a kind of command. Hester had known better. She had addressed the unknown without trying to own them. Thea set a sheet of cream paper on the counter, weighted the top with the blue glass marble, sharpened a pencil first, then chose ink instead. Some words deserved the risk of permanence. The stove burned low. The finished rug lay rolled beside the work table, tied with cotton tape. The 30 samples rested in their cabinet. The flag slept in its archival box. The medal held its small bronze silence. The brass key lay on the mantel. The new sign watched from above the counter. Snow gathered on the porch rail outside, softening the missing places winter had not yet found again. Thea wrote the first line slowly. "My dear one, whoever you are." Then she stopped, not because she had nothing to say, but because there was too much, and too much must be made exact before being given. She rose, checked the stove, washed the cup from her evening tea, and returned to the counter. On the next line, she wrote the date, December 21st, 224. After that, she began with the plainest truth she knew. "If this letter has found your hands, then something I loved has outlived my voice." She did not write about being locked out. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. Some wounds become smaller when refused the honor of becoming the center. She wrote instead about the well and how long to boil water before testing, about the chimney and how smoke tells on bad mortar, about DAP 33 glazing putty and the way old glass must be seated with room enough to move, about cotton sash cord and the figure-8 knot, about the roof, the chalk line, the 3-stroke nail, and Amos saying a nail was proud, about Orland's account book, about Doris's biscuits, about Mrs. Crowell's dollar, about Caleb's sign. Then she wrote about the loom. She wrote that it should not be approached as a relic, though it had earned reverence. It was a tool. A tool was honored by use, maintenance, and rest in proper season. She copied Hester's temperatures for washing wool and dyeing madder. She added what her own failures had taught. Do not weave when exhausted enough to resent the thread. Do not cut pile after sundown. Do not accept every commission. Do not mistake urgency for calling. Do not repair a family's rug without asking what part of the damage they want preserved. Near midnight, she set down the pen. The letter was not finished. That was all right. Neither was the work, neither was the house, if anyone looked closely. The porch still needed one rail replaced. The back step held but would need attention by spring. The lane washed badly in hard rain. The well pump squealed despite oil. One corner of the back room still smelled damp after 3 days of fog, but unfinished no longer meant abandoned. Thea folded the beginning of the letter and placed it in a new envelope without sealing it. She wrote nothing on the front yet. That would come when the pages had earned their address. Then she carried the finished rug to the loom room and laid it across the lower beam for the night. Not because it belonged there permanently, but because first things deserved to sleep near the place that made them possible. The fire lowered. The shop held. Outside, the walnut tree stood in snow with its horseshoe half swallowed, and its brass secret closed again beneath bark and beeswax. The creek moved under a skin of ice along the edges, speaking softly through the center where water remained open. The lane between the 2 walnuts disappeared under white, and beyond it the road bent toward town, toward the cafe, the hardware store, the clerk's office, the cemetery, the library, and all the ordinary places where a life had been handed, one small mercy at a time. Thea stood in the doorway between front room and loom room. The warp threads on the great oak frame were new now. set by her own hands, even and pale in lamplight. They waited without accusation. Tomorrow there would be another row to knot, another bill to pay, another repair to make, another name to write correctly on a tag. Nothing grand enough for strangers to gather around, nothing loud enough to become news, only the slow continuance of care. A knotted rug loom waits. It has always waited, and in the county clerk's office, beneath the tray of paper clips in Mrs. Crowell's desk, a worn $1 bill remained folded inside a small envelope, quiet as seed. Kept in the dark where beginnings sometimes belong,